Hello. Thank you for joining me for this very late live stream. Probably people are immediately, if this is coming through, people are immediately noticing that there's something missing. Yes, I had to shave my beard for reasons that sorry, my wife's trying to get attention to me. I can't tell what she wants. But anyway, I'm, hopefully this is coming in and people are seeing this. I don't know why all these interruptions happen the exact second that I go live, but that's going to have to be what it is. Great. So yeah, I guess it's been a while since I've done one of these live streams. I want to do them once a month. I'd like to do them more frequently, obviously. I always feel a little bit bad when I have to do one of these live streams before I've released an edited video beforehand, but recently someone told me that, if I'm going slow with a video, as I have been the last month, I should just really do a live stream because that's content, people like it, and, as long as the uploads or the live streams aren't too frequent, I don't think they're going to be detracting from the overall quality of this channel. The most recent video I'm working on is finishing up an old video that was a continuation of the Trad Codex series that I was doing several years ago. I keep on trying to record the second half of it, and I keep on encountering problems. Ordinarily, these problems are usually really easy to overcome, but now I just have so little time. I have like these little hours here and there, and at the end of the day, it gets to be about 10 p.m., and you just don't want to start a recording project for some reason. I guess when you have the time cleared, like I do for these live streams, it's a little bit easier. And I suppose I could just schedule in a 2-hour period and be really, really focused, but it doesn't always work out like that. But, okay, I guess people are hearing me now, so I'm just going to continue on with the live stream topic as planned. So, general plan for this live stream, what we're going to be doing tonight is I'm going to be kind of giving my reactions to a conversation that's been going on the right-wing YouTube channels that remain over the last month or so. Then I'm going to go on and I'm going to answer the questions. There were a bunch of super chat questions. So way back when I did my last one of these to stand streams, a number of people gave super chats, and I usually take a long time to answer super chats. And as it happened, I kind of hit a deadline before I was able to finish answering all of the questions. And when I restarted the live stream several hours later to answer those questions, Google wasn't allowing me to refresh the super chats. For some reason, the display was delayed so that you couldn't see them until eventually, something needed to go through on their monetization system before they appeared on my actual receipt. So it wasn't another few days until I got the super chats, and by then it didn't feel right to do another distant stream just to answer those super chats. So after I go over the topic for tonight, I want to answer the missing questions that were kind of dropped by the system. I apologize, they're a little bit old at this stage, and then I'll get on to the general questions, people's super chats they have for this stream. People can make fun of the bald, the no beard distributus this time. What really happened is kind of a weird story, actually, and I hope this isn't too personal. But so I'm doing a bunch of professional stuff where I need to have a video feed, and for a while I had this beard when I didn't need to be face-to-face in a professional capacity for very many things. So I go to this barber shop, and admittedly, it's a really cheap barber shop. And I asked them to trim my beard because the beard's getting out of control. So they cut my hair and they trim my beard. But get this, they just trimmed the beard. And I guess I must have pulled like the face mask over my neck. So when they're like trimming the beard, they don't trim like the hair on the neck. So I walk out of the barber shop and I don't realize this, but like the beard's trimmed. I have this huge like puff of hair coming out of my neck. It's like, it's really insane. And by that time I'm just like, oh my God, this looks horrible. And I could not figure out a way to fix this horrible haircut and preserve my beard. So I just took the whole thing off. Maybe I'll grow it back, maybe I won't. But that was certainly one of the weirdest, I want to say worst haircuts I've ever gotten in my life. The other worst haircut I remember getting in my life, and this is kind of another story. So when I was getting married in Seattle, I remember that was a night before or 2 nights before we're doing the whole bachelor celebration thing, and the people are going out, and we were like, okay, we want to get, obviously my wedding's the next day or something. We were like, oh wow, we want to get like a straight razor shave. So for people who know me, back when I was a pretentious hipster, also living in Seattle, I used to like shave with a straight razor, right? And at some point I got really good at it before I realized that it was totally not worth the effort. If people know straight razors, you have to hone the razor, you have to sharpen the razor, and then you have to hone the razor, which means that you have to take the blade and you have to straighten it out. And all that effort for a much, much more difficult shave, and one that's almost always less close. But I'm told, and actually I believe that when I was living back east, I was actually able to get a professional straight razor shave, and it was really good. But this time I'm like, okay, we got to go get a straight razor shave because it'll be an experience. Of course, the barbers in Seattle were like these other hipster dudes. They had no idea how to use a straight razor. I could tell they were doing it wrong while they were shaving me, kind of Sweeney Todd style. But that's not the worst part. The worst part was that these barbers, they're all tattooed guys, and they were all like Antifa guys. And they were talking, while they were giving me the straight razor shave, they were talking to me, they were talking amongst themselves about how they're all going to travel down to Portland and like beat the shit out of Proud Boys because the Proud Boys were having a demonstration in Portland that weekend. So all the while, like they're running like these huge Sweeney Todd razors across my throat. They're talking about how they're going to essentially go and beat up right-wingers. Very next day. And I'm thinking, oh man, I mean, if only they knew this would really go in sort of a Sweeney Todd direction. So anyway, digressions aside, I assume at this stage people are hearing me. Otherwise, there probably would be all of these Fs in the chat. Yeah, I don't know. I think people are split between entropy and at this point they're split between entropy and YouTube chat. But if you guys want to actually chat with me and have me see it, then I encourage you to go to the entropy link and chat there. Unfortunately, I think everything will appear, and everything on the YouTube chat will appear on the entropy chat. There have been some problems. I think I lost one super chat from last things, although entropy is good enough that as soon as the super chat goes through, it appears on sort of your receipt. So I can pull up last things chat from there. Last Things is another YouTuber. I think I've linked to him before on my Telegram feed, but he's a really good up and coming reactionary YouTuber. I think he's a really good channel. His last video was on Black Mirror, and it was on one of the few Black Mirror episodes that I've actually seen, so that was really good. At any rate, I see people trickling in now. So today's talk, I guess, just to get to my main topic, and I know this is something that I've talked a lot about on previous occasions, but tonight's talk is really about the state of the online right in present year. This is something that I know a lot of people are. I mean, I know that this is a topic of conversation that's going on. Essentially, the right has been purged from major social media platforms. I didn't get purged from Twitter. I left Twitter. After 3 times trying to leave Twitter, I just up and deleted the entire thing. But I think in the process, a lot of people are trying to answer the question about how we're reacting to sort of a defeat. And this is a defeat for the right generally. It's kind of odd because people like me had zero faith in electoral politics and zero faith in sort of the processes that Trump was trying to bring to a head. But nonetheless, we're suffering for it in the post-Trump era. I think it's sort of undeniable. And this kind of gets me to the sort of... there's been a conversation going on between people like Don the Pleb and Academic Agent. And I know I've addressed Don the Pleb before. I know I've talked about this ad infinitum. I guess I'm going to have to talk about it again. But there are a number of ex-Trumpies, ex-Republicans who are sitting around and they kind of want to go back to the way things were. They kind of want to keep on fighting, but they have no idea how this is going to be done. And in the meantime, a hobby that they've taken up is bashing people that are frankly honest about the state of political dynamics in the modern world. I think sort of the quintessential example of this is Don the Pleb, but also there was another YouTuber under the name Is the Eunuch or Yiz the Eunuch. I think it was Yiz the Eunuch, which is a strange name, and I don't even know if the vlogger is male or female. Really, definitely a higher voice. So I don't know if that's. I don't know how literal the title of the channel is supposed to be taken. But the general, and this usually comes from a red state perspective. The general idea is that people are talking about, and this is something that Don the Pleb is very want to do. He likes posturing about. Posturing sounds pretty pejorative, but he likes posturing about how the right just doesn't want to win. The right doesn't want to win, and the people who are like myself and who are pacifists aren't really being honest about the need to keep on fighting. I know this is a conversation, and missing from all of this, and I guess the difficulty is these people love bashing the reactionary perspectives that what we are in the middle of is a cultural crisis that has deeper roots than merely political victories. And they constantly want to digress onto the fact that we can apply specific pressure at local levels. And this is true. Indeed, right-wingers can apply pressure at local levels. We can win elections for dog catcher. We can win elections for head librarian and chief ombudsman on the city council. You might even be able to win a random election as a state comptroller, but probably not in any larger state. At the same time, your avenues for wielding power at a political level or at a federal level are pretty much nil at this stage. And this is acknowledged by these people like Don the Pleb and Yiz. And I don't know. I mean, I appreciate people who want to run for office locally. I appreciate people who want to make a positive change in their community. I don't appreciate the posturing, and I also wonder, they always claim that they've taken on board the message and the learnings from neo-reaction, but they never seem to ever incorporate any of those learnings into their own work or into their own understanding or into their own analysis of what's going on. This conversation I had between myself and Don the Pleb was going on before Trump lost the election, and I think regardless of what we think about counts or recounts or fraud, indiscreet, or systemic form, regardless, Trump is no longer in power. He lost the election. Even if the other side played dirty, he's still out of power. He still lost the election. So from any real political point of view, we have to consider this an L. We were having this conversation, and what they'll always say is, okay, we've taken on board the reactionary critique. We understand what you're saying about Republican politics being stupid and ill-conceived and how you're playing by the progressives' rules. They say this, and we're like, okay, great. That's all we wanted you to take on board descriptively. And then immediately, the next day, right after they say they've taken this on board, their way of getting beyond Moldbug and coming to prescriptions on what to do next is essentially to do things that are obviously and transparently going to fail and backfire in their faces. A great example of this is the Million MAGA March and January 6th. And this is something that, I'm not going to name names here, but a lot of these people who were in this we need to do something camp, this post-reactionary camp, round about January 6th, it was kind of amazing to see this, but a lot of these people who are trying to bridge the gap between MAGA and neo-reaction, somehow they got sucked into the Trump hype train. And you immediately, during January 6th, people like myself and Aaron McIntyre are just looking at what's going on, realizing that this is a huge shit sandwich that we're all going to have to take a bite out of, and asking simple questions like, okay, guys, what's going to come out of this? We all know this is going to end badly for us, right? And you have people who say they understand how all of this post-liberal stuff work. They all get on their high horse and go, oh no, your guys are just a bunch of cowards. You guys, you have to stick to the party line, and the party line is Antifa rioted during summer, so this should be no big deal. Okay, great. Antifa rioted during summer. Their riots were way more deadly. Their riots were way more destructive. And 90% of the narratives that were concocted around January 6th were absolutely false. There was no cop, from what we know now, there was no cop who had his head bashed in with a fire extinguisher. For all we know, all of the murders that took place on January 6th were all from the government side murdering protesters. Murdering might be hard, killing protesters in the clashes and in the hooliganism or the riots that occurred on the Capitol building. But all of these circumstantial details that apply to the left's own hypocrisy when it comes to civil disobedience and civil disorder, all of this is meaningless. And if you've taken on board the descriptive reality that people like Yarvin and Spandrel and really anyone from the whole Jacobite crew, the post-political people, have been talking about for the last 2 years, you should know that the double standard is in place. That's not a defense, and it's not like somehow magically, if a few of us right-wingers in the NRX side, it's not like if we get on message that this will all turn around. It's not even like if Tucker Carlson gets on message, this will all turn around. The mainstream can spin this narrative with or without anyone on the right's help. And the double standard will be applied without anyone on the right, certainly myself, and not even people on Fox News. Everyone on Fox News can dissent and object to the double standard, and that will make no difference to how the people who participated in January 6th are treated, or how the system itself reacts to January 6th and the fictional optics they created around that event. As R.M. McIntyre pointed out, I'm perfectly fine with people getting past Molebug or going beyond Molebug to the prescriptive dimensions of how things are done. But you can't get beyond Molebug and then immediately unlearn the lessons of Molebug. It's insane. And you hear people like Don the Pleb say things like, oh, well, you guys did January 6th, but you just didn't follow through. Follow through? What was the follow through going to be from the Million MAGA March or January 6th? Like, given what you know about how our government works, no one from government, the bureaucrats that carry out procedures in elections, believed for a second that Trump's claims going in December or January would hold the day against Biden's. All Trump's hopes for actually pulling out a victory in the courts pretty much evaporated in late November. By January, everyone in the establishment knew that Trump had no possibility of being sworn in for a second term of office. For this reason, nobody in the administrative branch of the government would want to cooperate with protesters that were literally marching around the Capitol demanding that Trump be made president again for a second term. In the face of the very, very obvious wishes of pretty much every powerful person in DC, in the media and corporate establishment, and in the administrative branches of the government. Okay, so if you know that's how our government works, what does following through mean? Short of an actual military coup, short of Trump literally taking control of Congress and declaring himself president with the MAGA-peds as his army, there couldn't possibly be a follow-through if you descriptively understood the process. So what were you sending people to do in this environment? That's sort of my question here. And all the while, you hear people say things, and this is another thing they'll say. People in this activist branch, like Yiz or Don the Pleb, they'll say things like, well, we just need everyone who's on our side to give like 15 minutes of your time. 15 minutes of your time to do X, Y, and Z. I think this is bullshit. Like 50 minutes, like what? I assume it's like 50 minutes a day or a week or something like that. This is bullshit. What is this going to do? An army of people dedicating 15 minutes of their time is not going to accomplish anything, in my opinion. I know this is sort of the opposite of what I'm supposed to say as a YouTuber. I'm supposed to say, everyone should just give me, 15 minutes of your time, $1 of super chats, and we'll be winning. that's the message that probably would be lucrative because it probably would elicit more super chats. Um, but it's not true. It's not true. This is sort of the whole idea that you're going to win by having an army of people who are running phone banks, or you're going to win because you have a bunch of retirees who are dedicating a small fraction of their time, putting in a minimal amount of effort and doing something, carrying out a simple command, or just being a body on the field. 50 minutes a day is pretty much the dynamic that was playing out in the Million MAGA March or on January 6th. These are people that were more or less private citizens. They all had jobs. They all had other revenue streams. They weren't professional activists in any capacity. They all showed up. They all dedicated their time, right? They had no larger direction or no larger idea what they wanted to accomplish. And as such, not only were they immediately surrounded by the establishment, their presence there was essentially fuel for the fire in the largest crackdown and consolidation of power that the Democratic Party and the mainstream left has ever taken in this country. We're pretty much on the road to one-party rule if we're not at one-party rule already. And a large part of what accelerated that was January 6th and the protest efforts that obtained afterwards. And that's a reality that I'm not so sure how to square with Don the Pleb's attitude towards all of this. It doesn't generally make sense to me. And you know, I hear this. I understand what these people are working with. Yiz, when she was talking, or when they were talking to Academic Agent, they were talking about getting people motivated to do things like make phone calls to representatives. And they were very frustrated. Yiz was very frustrated with responses like, oh, well, it's all in God's hands. Or this is something for the next generation to deal with. That was very frustrating for Yiz. And I appreciate that. But those are kind of responses that I typically hear from people who are much older. I'm talking about like baby boomers and above. I can tell from those responses that Yiz is talking to people who are retirees. And that's a problem. Obviously, you get people to vote who are retirees. You can make little pushes on the political dimension through the use of people who are older. But if we're talking about the mainstay of the left's power, the mainstay of the left's power is not from having an army of people who are essentially retirees and who are putting in a little bit of time and a little bit of money on the side. Their power comes from having a dedicated activist class that's funded and that is creating art and that's creating, well, essentially constant political activism and passionate political activism. There is something that Mencius Moldbug said in one of his earlier, and was this? I think this was an original UR. I think this was an original UR take from Curtis Yarvin. He said something along the lines of, if my choice were the entire 40% of the people who consistently vote Republican in this country, and then having the top 10% or some 10% fraction of the people who attend Burning Man, I'd pick some 10% of the people who attended Burning Man. Because I know that any right-wing movement that had a core dedicated artistic and activist class would eventually get back the 40% of the people who voted Republican anyway. But 40% of this entire country's population that consistently votes Republican, or 35% or 30%, it's totally incapable of developing a vanguard constituency in the class that typically attends Burning Man. And this is something that I think is fundamentally misunderstood. When I say that we need elite representation, I don't mean that we need George Soros. I don't mean that we need a billionaire who's going to write us a check, or I would love a sugar daddy who could write me, a blank check so I could do this full time and I wouldn't have to contend with a day job. That would be great. But that's not what I'm saying when we need elite vanguard representation. What I'm saying is we need more people from the classes, from essentially the cultural creation classes. We need more artists. We need more people who are interested in things like who are interested in creative endeavors and who have a voice or a presence inside the metropolitan areas where these creative endeavors play out. Without that, I'm not so sure how far you're going to get with an army of peasants. If history is any judge, you're not going to get very far at all. And this is something that I fundamentally think is a misunderstanding among almost all normie Republicans, especially Republicans who sort of transparently are coming from the red state perspective. Excuse me. I think that this is something that, if we look at the life and death of, for instance, a movement like the alt-right, and this is a case study, right? So the alt-right had sort of two lessons attached to it. Like, we can ask, what made the alt-right scary for the left for a brief period in 2017? And then what made the alt-right suddenly go from being something that scared the shit out of the left? From about late 2016 to late 2017, the alt-right, in concept, was a force that scared the shit out of the left. They wouldn't talk about it because they were scared to confront it. Then, around late 2017, right when I made my video on the alt-right, coincidentally, the alt-right shifted from being something that the left kind of talked about in whispered tones, and they were afraid of confronting, into a topic that the left was ever so ready to discuss, and ever ready to have mock debates against and score points on. Okay, so let's go over this, because I think this sort of demonstrates both the dynamics of why I'm so skeptical about these sort of mass plebeian movements that seem to be constantly the fascination of formerly Republican or formerly MAGA people who live largely in red states. So the alt-right was initially scary, not because of how many people they had, because they never had very many people. The alt-right was scary because of the kind of people that were attracted to it. People, and this is mainly in Europe, but people would see people like Millennial Woes, for instance. They would see people like a lot of the early alt-right vloggers who were prominent, and they would suddenly realize that they weren't dealing with a bunch of people from rural areas who didn't have college educations. Millennial Woes, to take an example, his contemplative nature and his more thoughtful approach to topics was one of the chief things that largely scared the left so much about the alt-right, because they didn't quite know how to react to that. They didn't quite know how to deal with an intellectual vanguard from a far-right perspective. Now, as I've gone over many, many times in my video about the alt-right, I had a number of philosophical disagreements at the core of what the alt-right was trying to do, even in its ascendant form in late 2017. But regardless of what those core philosophical disagreements were with the alt-right, they never really came to a head, because by the time I published that video, the alt-right was on his deathbed. And it went from being in ascendancy to its deathbed really in the space of about 1 month. And that month was the month where the Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville. And this is because they took a movement that was largely, in its inception, made from a dynamic that took the left, I should say, off its preferred narrative, and in one protest, in really only one protest, with one death, there was one death in that protest, and given the fact that there are probably at least 50 people that have been killed in Black Lives Matter protests, explicitly murdered, from what I can tell. And again, statistics are statistics, so it depends on how we count this. But the body count on the Black Lives Matter has been much higher. But with one protest and one death, that movement was dead and has never resurrected. And in the intermittent years, in the years between 2017 and now, and it's been 3 years, that ghost of the alt-right has been more lucrative for the left and for BreadTube than it has ever been for the right. ContraPoints essentially launched their career as a mainstreamer off their takes about the alt-right. Vosh and Destiny largely built their careers around taking down the alt-right. Now, I think a lot of these takedowns of the alt-right were completely illusionary. I don't believe they took on the alt-right's main intellectual arguments, and everyone's ready to point out that they're essentially fighting against an enemy that's being deplatformed before their very eyes. They're essentially tearing down a Potemkin Satan. But that didn't matter, because the optics and the narratives were so aptly used. The optics and the narratives of Charlottesville could prevent the alt-right from making any expansions in a popular direction. Now, I mean, this is to say, I guess, is that we see what scared the left was an intellectual vanguard. What undid the alt-right was an all-comers big tent populist movement. And that's because the second you go into a popular mode and try to just get more bodies on the field, at least from a right-wing perspective, you lose quality control. And if you lose quality control, you lose everything. And in asking right-wingers to all get on message, like this is going to impact the overall message taken to the mainstream, this is a total illusion. No amount of getting on message could save the alt-right after Charlottesville. Because the alt-right wasn't telling the story about Charlottesville. The mainstream media was. And the imagistics from that demonstration provided the mainstream media with all the narrative it ever needed. Now, I know that Don the Pleb is, or the various people who are doing this, or who are trying to react, who are trying to forge some kind of activist narrative after the loss in 2020, I assume that they're aware of how this has played out in the past. And January 6th played a very similar role, I should say, to the Magapeds. Their losses in January 6th, the optics, and in many ways the fictional optics that the left created in the wake of that loss, allowed for a devastation of the MAGA community on most mainstream media platforms, on Facebook, on Twitter. They got rid of Trump. They got rid of major Facebook and Twitter posts that talked about Donald Trump. It was an outright purge. And that's leaving aside the purge of MAGA sympathetic forces that could be in the armed forces. There's a massive consolidation of power. That's not a victory. And I think we need to sort of stand back and say, like, that activism is not a victory. So that activism, again, that's absolutely losing. If you're saying that you need to push back against the Democratic power grabs, then big tent political activism has to be seen as absolutely detrimental to that larger goal. I don't see any other way of reading it. What isn't detrimental is some kind of post-left movement that comes from an intellectual elite vanguard. I know that this sounds horribly elitist, and I think this is what people like Don the Pleb are reacting to. But this is the only way forward that I think actually makes any amount of sense. Any kind of large populist movement is so easy to subvert at this stage that I'm not even so sure what it's ultimately worth. It's actually sort of fodder for the left at this stage. I mean, and I know the sort of example is, oh, well, we can become a city controller in Michigan, or I can become an elected dog catcher in Orange County, California. Okay, sure. We could snipe minor political offices away from the left, but you'll never be able to use those minor political offices in the same way the left does. What does the left use when it gets minor political offices? What it does is it fills them with political cronies that don't really solve the problems they're elected to solve, and instead use the position of power to advance their agenda in other dimensions. This works because they largely have a sympathetic right-wing or left-wing media. So, for instance, if you were an educational director in the PTA, or even if you were, I don't know, does California have a Secretary of Education? I think they do. Even, let's say you were in charge of some you're in charge of some minor state office in terms of California education, and you're just an out-and-out social justice warrior. You're 100% on this trans thing, and you think that a major issue of your tenure should be to push the trans agenda. That will get played in the mainstream media as if you are a principled crusader for an ideal who just happens to be a public servant. If you did that in the right, as a right-winger, there is no way that would ever work. The media would eat you alive. The second they realized that you were using your office as elected dog catcher to do other things. If your tenure as dog catcher was anything other than sterling, was anything other than the best damn dog catcher that county had ever had, the narrative that came out of this was the right wing is launching a covert attempt to subvert our political institutions, to essentially let stray dogs plague the city, the Orange County, California, while pushing a nefarious, ultra-right-wing agenda. There is no symmetry on these on these tactics. So, while I certainly welcome any right-winger, any sympathetic reactionary individual like Don the Pleb to snipe these minor political offices away from the left, any idea that this is going to procure for the right the same kind of political advantage that it obtains to the left is utterly mythological. And it's not because we don't want to win. It's not because we're a bunch of cowards, like Don the Pleb implies. It's not because they've secretly been infiltrated by pacifists and the people who get into these offices read too much Mencius Mollbug or Spandrel or they subscribe to Jacobite magazine. That's not the reason why there's an asymmetry here. The asymmetry originates from the fact that the intellectual, artistic, and media classes are all sympathetic to the Democratic Party, and they're all proponents of the left-wing cultural agenda that the Democratic Party is fundamentally aligned with. That is the cause of this asymmetry. And it's not cowardice that's causing it. It's not because we don't want to win. I get it that this is what's fun to do. Like, this is what's fun to do. The fun message, and you can tell that this is irritating me. The fun message that these post-MAGA types are pushing is that we're all a bunch of cowards and we just didn't fight hard enough. We haven't fought hard enough in the past, and we're not fighting hard enough now. And I don't think they've even necessarily understood the lessons of NRX, but because NRX is fundamentally a pacifist political movement, we fit very well into their narrative, where they can get on their soapbox and kind of like poo-poo people for not fighting hard enough, because that's a good place to start. It's kind of hogwash. I welcome Don the Pleb for coming in and correcting me here, but this is absolutely a bunch of hogwash, humbug, as they used to say. No such getting on message from the right is ever going to impact this. And I think everyone can sort of see this very plainly at this stage. If there's going to be any kind of, as I've said this before, if there's ever going to be any kind of coordinated pushback on the left, it is not going to be something that even remotely resembles the Republican Party of old. And I'm not saying it's not going to be some kind of big tent. In some sense, it's going to be a big tent, but it's not going to operate in the same kind of way. If people want to pursue careers as elected dog catchers or state controllers or ombudsmen, they're going to have to do so under a different set of rules than the people who want to explore radical ideas. If we have the people who are exploring radical ideas or radical post-left ideas in an intellectual space, and they're flying the same political banner as people who are running for state controller, that is going to be an utter disaster. That is going to be an utter disaster because one is going to be used to subvert the other one. You're going to have essentially people, activists. Once political activists are going into your intellectual space and constraining it, the intellectual space is fundamentally broken. Once you have crazy ideas from an intellectual space essentially poisoning your results in the polls, you have pollution in the other direction. And maybe this means that both parties have to operate under different flags, under different movements, in different regards. That might be the case. But I'm sorry, there's just not going to be an easy way to cross-pollinate these things. There's not going to be a way to have these things operating in the same capacity. The other thing I think that, and I know this is sort of not very well prepared, but I'm just kind of meandering through these talking points. The other thing that we're going to have to, so I guess the first thing that's going to have to go by the wayside in any post-left movement is going to be an understanding that we're going to make one common movement, both for politics and for culture. I think that's going to be completely out. I think what's going to happen is people who run for office are going to have to run as people who are going to competently execute that office. That's the only path that the Democratic Party is going to have open to us. Any ideological infiltration in that regard is completely closed from my point of view. And this is not very poetic. This is just how I'm seeing it right now. On the opposite end, on the intellectual front, on the cultural front, any right-wing movement or any post-left movement is going to fundamentally have to walk away from the symbolism of the old right-wing, the old Republican, the old Thatcherite parties. And this is going to start, and I know people are going to hate this in Don's camp, this is going to start with walking away from this ridiculous dedication to the Constitution. Okay, so this is sort of the talk that I actually kind of wanted to talk about. So I talked about this in one of Don's videos. He kind of comes off as being post-Republican, post-Trump, but then he goes back to complaining about how the Democrats aren't following the Constitution. This doesn't work. It doesn't work because the Constitution, saying that, if you were to go up in front of a camera today and say, this law or this action taken by the Biden administration is unconstitutional, what are you actually saying? First of all, I should give Don the plebs rebuttal. So I said that this Constitution stuff is absolutely positively cringe for most people, because we realize at this state that the Constitution is completely subverted and we have not been following the Constitution at least for 80 years, possibly, depending on your interpretation, for 150 years since the end of the Civil War. But any kind of conceivable reading with the intention of the Founding Fathers, that was discarded pretty readily at the end of the New Deal. And the elites at that point decided that they were not bound by the Constitution. And of course, Don's rebuttal is this. Don's rebuttal is, well, Dave, the left has subverted everything. The left has subverted Christianity. The left has subverted America. So do we walk away from everything? We have to fight on some principle, and that might as well be the Constitution. So we're going to keep on fighting for the Constitution. This is an absolute mistake, and this is a mistake that we're going to have to get over. We have to recognize the difference between core principles, core aesthetic preferences, core spiritual truths, and then old laws that have been long since replaced. And I'm going to answer this question. This question can quite easily be answered by someone like Joseph de Maistre. He wrote a very, very good pamphlet called, I think it's called The Generative Nature of Constitutions. On the generative nature of constitutions, meaning how constitutions come forth and what gives them their legitimacy. This is a set of essays that was highly cited, I should say. This, among other things, was highly cited by Carl Schmitt in his equally good essay, Political Theology. So fundamentally, and de Maistre is very right to point this out, what any constitution leaves out is a question of sovereignty. Any constitution is simply a promise. Any law is simply a promise. That's all a law is. That's all a constitution is. It is simply a promise made to the future. Hold on a second. Pardon me. Your sound's on. What? Mute your sound. What? Sorry about that, guys. I apologize. Are you guys still hearing me? Hopefully I'm at the same volume that I was previously. Okay. Okay, so the question is, and the question is for all right-wingers at this stage. The question for all right-wingers at this stage is, since we have essentially suffered a defeat, I think a very total defeat insofar as Republican politics is concerned, what emerges afterwards? What do we fight for? What do we abandon? What is eternal and what is transitory? What is something that can be discarded? Don the Pleb thinks that the Constitution is something that's eternal. I don't think it is. Or if it is, it's something that's deeper than the Constitution and that lies beneath it. Okay, so what is a Constitution? A Constitution is simply a law. That's all it is. What is a law? A law is simply a promise. A law is simply a promise by some kind of political body, by some sovereign body, that it will obey this rule going into the future. That's all it is. It's not even something that's necessarily binding, because as D. Maistre pointed out in passing in his treatise on constitutions, and as Carl Schmitt was later able to take and put a finer point on, with the definition of sovereign, there always will have to be exceptions to the Constitution. There will always have to be ways that we can find exception, or that we can say, okay, well, this promise, there has to be an exception to it, right? There has to be an exception made here, and we have to do something differently. The sovereign is the person who decides the exception. The sovereign is also the only person that gives the promise meaning to begin with. So the question is, if the Constitution is simply a law, and if a law is simply a promise, who is the person who makes the promise, and who is the person that decides the exception? The ultimate answer to this is the United States government. And in the case of the American Constitution, the Supreme Court. This creates a problem for people who are constitutionalists, because the political class of this country has not believed in the literal interpretation of the Constitution as written or as intended for the last 80 years. They obviously have not believed in that. So what do they believe in? So we already know that there's going to be a major exception made. What they do believe in is they believe in progressivism. They believe that the Constitution can have an exception made to it because progressivism and the force of progressivism overrides the Constitution itself. Now, originally, why do Western countries, why do people in the Christian world believe in this thing called rights and constitutions and rule of law in this quasi-spiritual way when people in Africa and people in China think it's hogwash? They don't really have the same understanding of the Constitution that we do. This is kind of an interesting trick, and I don't know if I'm really explaining it in a worthy way here because I'm simply speaking on the fly. Well, the reason why, when the founders wrote down the Constitution, it felt immediately like there was some kind of spiritual force behind it. The spirituality that Don the Pleb is, even 250 years later, still feeling the force of. The reason why there seemed to be spiritual force behind this notion of rights in the West, but the notion of rights in other cultural contexts just seems to be something that the government gives you and could take away at any time, is because Western rulers and Western sovereigns, going back well before the Founding Fathers came around, they believed that their promises and their word were granted some kind of permanence through their relationship to a spiritual entity, specifically through their relationship to Christ and God. And core to the Christian religion is this understanding that God is sovereign And only by obeying God's word and only by obeying God's moral commandments can humans even temporarily wield sovereignty. For this reason, Christian lawmakers and even Christian kings are bound to their own laws and are bound to a standard of consistency that transcends merely their whims in any given moment. Therefore, if a Christian king announces a principle or announces a law, he is beholden to those very laws. And then if a Christian law-making body announces that something is a law, this is somehow imbued with the moral force of the sovereign that inspired that law. This is why, when the Founding Fathers wrote the Declaration of Independence, there's sort of this implicit role for this nature or nature's God type concept. Without that, the entire notion of rights and a constitution that means anything more than a temporal decree made by a dictator is absolutely meaningless. The sovereign can always revoke his own will. It's only the Christian notion that sovereignty itself, or the sovereignty of God, commands humans to be consistent and adhere to moral principle, that even gives the notions of rights or constitutions their permanent nature in our own imaginations. So it's really funny because, and this is where sort of the problems come in, right? And you see sort of how the progressive heresy comes about and is so powerful in our present age. Okay, fair enough. So if, for instance, the force of nature or nature's God, the force of progress as Whig Christians see it, this was the animating force behind the idea of rights in the Constitution. If this was the animating sovereign force, what progressive judges implicitly see themselves as doing is they see themselves as essentially abrogating the law of the old in the name of the spirit that animated it. What was the spirit that animated it? Well, it was the same sort of quasi-Einsteinian God, the same kind of universalist God that was found in the Declaration of Independence, saying that all men are created equal and endowed with their Creator by certain unalienable rights. That is the God that the Supreme Court works in the name of when they discover their living Constitution. The living Constitution lives in the direction of universalist Christianity and really cannot grow in any other direction legitimately. Therefore, when Don the Pleb tries to take this document, resurrect it into the present day, what is he actually saying? He's saying, in effect, that promises made by a previous Congress should be obeyed above promises made by the people who are enacting Congress's and America's current promises. That's bullshit. It's transparent bullshit, and everyone can see through it. I'm telling this to Don the Pleb. Maybe we obviously circulate in different circles. Progressives find the conservative adherence to the Constitution to be laughable and quaint because of the fact that they believe they are transparent. They believe that the Constitution itself derives from a spiritual tradition that they are more in communion with than anyone like Don the Pleb is, and because they are obviously de facto and political in charge. They're politically in charge of the institutions that determine the meaning of the Constitution itself. So this is not true with anything that's spiritual, poetic, or that claims to have a higher origin inside a connection to God. This is why the Bible, this is why the Holy Scripture, either in its Hebrew form, its Greek form, or any of the other Christian witnesses that have occurred inside and outside the church, formally, throughout the centuries, this is why these forces are so fundamentally different than the document of the Constitution. It's because they do not claim authority from anything else other than the direct author of authority and sovereignty itself. I'll give this example. So suppose, as is the case in all these conversations, that we assume worse comes to worse, that we're all going to get sent away to gulags because of our dissident beliefs. Let's take a page from the original gulags. Let's say that you're on a train to the gulags as a political dissident. And inside the gulags, you want to find the true principled men. The true principled men who are not going to betray you in these gulags and are going to be stand-up people who really have their heads screwed on straight. So inside the train, going to the gulag, you encounter a few people who have been sent to the gulags for various deviations from the Communist Party line. The first person is a person who's he's getting sent to the gulags because he's more communist than Comrade Stalin is. That's the first person. The second person, so he's like a Trotskyist. He wants to be more like Marx than Comrade Stalin, but Comrade Stalin came in and said, "No, you're too much of an idiot idealist. You're standing in the way of my power. Go to the gulag." The second person is a communist revolutionary who didn't want to go as far as Comrade Stalin. He wanted to go all the way 90% towards Stalinism. He wanted to stop somewhere, around Lenin's new economic plan. And Stalin wanted to go a little bit further. So he's to the gulags because he's dissenting from the rule that Comrade Stalin has set out. Okay, fair enough. The third person being sent to the gulags is a Soviet soldier who was asked to fire on distance and said no. The fourth person being sent to the gulags is an artist who was asked to depublish his book or to tear down his painting and said no to that. The book is not explicitly political, but it contains some kind of message that Stalin didn't like, and because of that, he's being sent to the gulags for his own artistic expression, his own aesthetic vision, which is not in line with the aesthetic vision of the Stalinist Communist Party. And the fifth person being sent to the gulags is being sent to the gulags because he is preaching the gospel of Christianity as it has existed in Orthodox Church teaching and as it is expressly stated in an honest reading of the Gospels and the subsequent Christian witnesses of the early church. Which of these five men would you think were principled, and which of these five men are kind of political pieces of shit that are rightly or wrongly getting what's coming to them? I would argue that the last three individuals, the artist, the moralist, and the religious believer, are the people who are going to the gulags with principle, and will be the people who will construct a new vision of what it is to be post-communist. The people who are going to the gulags because they're more communist than the Communist Party, or because they're less communist than the Communist Party, are not. They're essentially fastened on this idea that somehow a political promise, e.g. communism in the 19th century, actually meant something more than the people making that political promise, e.g. the Communist Party leaders themselves. They're essentially following the shadows of the dead God. And I think that is what the Constitution is. The Constitution is the shadow of a dead God. The dead God is the progressive Christian deistic God that was alive in the 18th century, that probably had his last hurrah in the late 20th century with Einstein and Professor Dawkins himself, and is now being devoured by communism proper in the 21st century before our very eyes. The idea that we're going to follow this false God is kind of ridiculous. And I'd really ask Don the Pleb, what is the spiritual force that makes you believe in the Constitution? It's a dead legal letter. The people who made that promise have long since passed into the grave. It's either an aesthetic preference, a moral preference, or the product of a living God. And saying something is an aesthetic preference or a moral preference is, in my mind, equivalent to saying that it is a direct revelation from a living God. Those are the only three things that are worth fighting for in a political collapse. Fighting for the previous regime's promises to you that are now being subverted by the current regime is idiotic. It's like saying that we're going to fight for rules that were abrogated by the current rule maker. It's like trying to hold someone's preferences against themselves when they have any opportunity and any right to remake those preferences. And to Don the Pleb, to Yiz the Eunuch and to all the other people who are sort of the post-MAGA crowd, as I will call them. I'm perfectly willing to take any kind of political action. I'm going to continue fighting and I'm going to continue speaking as long as I have a platform to fight and speak right now. But I'm not going to fight for dead gods or false gods masquerading as principles or masquerading as laws, when they're obviously not. And the Constitution is a dead god. It has not been valid law. I mean, it's been an explicitly broken promise for the last 10 years. It's been an implicitly broken promise for the last 80 years. And it was transparently something that's changed it's been transparently something that's been fundamentally changeable since the end of the Civil War. And under those circumstances, the idea that the Jeffersonian God, that the spirit of progress and human rights without any guiding principle, the idea that this could operate in time without any greater contact with a living spiritual, aesthetic, moral, and religious perspective, the idea that it could operate independently from that is hogwash. It was hogwash in the 18th century when Joseph de Maistre pointed it out. It was hogwash in the 19th century when the 19th century reactionaries pointed it out. And it's hogwash now that Spandrel and Molbug and whoever else, and even me right now, are pointing out that this is transparently bullshit. And I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to sacrifice my children's future for an imaginary element called the Constitution or an imaginary fiction called America. You have two roles as practical political entities. You can give me results. You can be a good dog catcher. You can say that I'm going to get real political power inside the political apparatus as it exists currently, and I'm going to justify the political power as thus. Fair enough. If Don the Pleb wants to run for a minor political office or a state office, I'm totally for that. You can also say that I'm going to have a separatist community. I'm also for that. As a matter of fact, separatism and parallelism are the key components of pacifism. As much as Don the Plague might not like that, that's exactly my jam. He has this project that he's calling Pleb Ranch, where he wants to do, based farming, or maybe have a server farm, do cryptocurrency on the side, totally independent of Uncle Sam. That sounds like an awesome idea. I totally 100% approve of that. That's a great idea. Does it have anything to do with the Constitution? Not really. Is it something that I can't participate in as a pacifist? Certainly not. It's 100% what a pacifist would recommend you do. But that being said, I'm not participating in some kind of benighted political movement or marrying a larger goal of developing new spiritual, new aesthetic, and new cultural perspectives. I'm not marrying that to some kind of ill-conceived big tent political movement marching in the name of a dead political document. That's bullshit. For once, I want to hear progressives tell me what they think free speech means. Because if I'm being honest, free speech actually means what progressives will allow me to have. In real political terms, free speech in America is what progressives allow it to be. If progressives think that free speech extends from the Constitution, then how about for once progressives explain to me exactly why we need to pay so much attention to this 250-year-old document in 2020? I'd like to hear that coming from a progressive, because right now, all you hear from progressives is talk about equality, rights in the abstract, and then a scoffing perspective about constitutionalist conservatives that aren't really living up to the all men are created equal philosophy that obviously was the real force behind the Constitution when it was put into law so many centuries back. And at this point, I'm ready to dissolve this question as it's existed between academic agent, myself, Don the Pleb, and Yiz the Eunuch. If you want real political results on a local scale, it's basically shit or get off the pot. If you want deeper cultural and spiritual movements, that is going to have to be constructed in a much, much more focused arena. It's going to have to be people who are interested in making long-form content, contemplative works of cultural fiction, and communicating with, fostering, and growing an elite vanguard of people that are at the center of things. they don't necessarily need to be living in blue areas and in urban areas. They need to be people who know how to communicate with those cultural epicenters. And they need to be people who communicate with a broader world. I'm not so sure that's a project that can be wedded to a localist political movement that wants to seize immediate power at a very, very minor level. It certainly can't be wedded to any kind of movement that's going to have large political demonstrations in a very, very loud and disruptive way, in the way that we saw at Charlottesville and also on January 6th in the Capitol. Maybe that's going to have to be a parting of ways. But if Don the Pleb is going to promise that this is the path to victory, that obtaining minor local political victories against the left is a path to something, he's going to have to answer a few follow-up questions. I know Yiz the Eunuch was saying that, we need these political victories because it's going to buy us time. It's going to buy us time. It's going to buy us time. Yeah, I know, and that's more or less what Trump bought us. Trump bought us time. Fair enough. What did we use that time for? Well, what I used that time for, obviously, during the Trump administration, I got my PhD, I got married, I had a kid, and I got a job. That personally for me was what I did in those 4 years. But insofar as my political activism has gone, I, perhaps to my credit, perhaps to my shame, used that time to build political clout on platforms that were largely controlled by woke corporations that hate my guts. Let's be honest, that's what I did. I've been banned from Discord about 3 or 4 times at this stage. It's getting kind of humorous at this stage. People are still messaging me on Discord wondering why I don't check the messages there on my 4th fake account. I think they can put 2 and 2 together with that one. But moving on. That's what the time was used for. That's not nothing. That's not nothing. In some sense, the clout obtained by the right on social media was of a different kind and was of a fundamentally more scary variety than the clout developed by the Republican Party in the last 30 years. The clout developed by the Republican Party was loud, it was rural, it was anti-intellectual, and for a brief period in 2017, the intellectual emergence of the right online genuinely scared the left. This period of time is coming to a close. The left is no longer scared of the dissident right the way they were in 2017. And although they understand, or the smarter ones among them understand that the left is weaker than they ever have been, they believe that in a political sense, insofar as the right manifests on mainstream platforms and tries to get clout there, they know that they have the right's number. Because there isn't a single dissident right-wing channel at this stage that has over 100,000 subscribers, to my knowledge. They're either essentially in the edgier realm of the MAGA neighborhood, or they've been banned. Stephen Molyneux's gone, Alex Jones is gone. I was never a fan of those 2 channels, but they're gone. In the meantime, almost all of the old alt-right channels are gone. Millennial Woes just got banned. Way of the World, I think, got banned on the offensive to close down his channel, probably reading the writing on the wall. And you can just basically go down the line. It's all been purged. The online left no longer is genuinely concerned that they'll have to face a hard right-wing critique of their ideas. They know they're not going to have to face this. They also know that they're weak, but they know that they're never going to have to face this. If we're going to buy time by doing local activism, of which I have no intention of doing myself, because I don't think it's worthwhile, especially where I live, but if Yiz the Eunuch wants me to give deference to the people who are buying us time, the follow-up question is what we're going to use that time for. And I would argue what we're using that time for is a much, much more important question, and how we're going to buy that time itself. How you're going to buy that time is pretty easy. You have to trip up the left. The right can do that. I can buy you 4 years. I can buy you a little bit of time. But unless you're really focused with what you're going to do, and unless that wish is something that's actually possible, and if strictly speaking, that's actually something you'd want. What's the point? Well, am I going to buy you 4 more years so that you can re-teach people the principles of my constitution? You're going to teach people from Africa with no cultural connection to the founding, with no necessary understanding of the spiritual tradition that led to the founding, that this document written 250 years ago that allowed for slavery of Africans, that this is somehow some kind of sacred document that's binding, even though the apparatus that breathes life into this document has long since decided that this document is not active law? I mean, good luck with that. You can't even sell me on that. Good luck selling new immigrants on that. Good luck forming a new coalition, a new political coalition with that. Good luck forming a new intellectual coalition. Where do new constitutional conservatives come from? Where do new people like Don the Pleb, who want to base their fight on my constitution, come from? They don't come from the third world, where the population is growing. They don't come from American universities, where the elites are growing. They don't come from Asia. Asia is having a resurgence of reactionary feelings. There's new right-wingers in India. There's new right-wingers in China. Are any of those right-wingers my constitution people? Of course not. That's not their tradition. They might be able to cooperate and communicate in broader right-wing terms, but they're not going to communicate in the language of the founding fathers, I can tell you that. This document, this approach, is dead. What the right needs to figure out is a new aesthetic vision and where it's going to get new elite members that follow that aesthetic vision. I was talking a few weeks ago on a live stream, I think it was on Settlers Lament channel, and people were talking about how, the left, it's able to convert away evangelical Christian children so easily. And at the time I was like saying, okay, guys, don't panic, right? Don't panic, because, it is true that evangelicals, they have a very high apostasy rate to progressivism and to progressive causes. This is well known. The evangelical kids that go to college and then they rebel against their normal Republican parents and they become shit libs and purple-haired trans people. That's a stereotype. But when you look at the numbers, statistically, it's very small. And I was kind of kicking myself for saying this because immediately I knew that the numbers themselves don't give color to the real problem. If you were to look at the evangelical community and ignore the Catholic community, of whose apostasy rates are a little bit better at elite levels, the evangelical movement's apostasy to progressivism is, by the numbers, very, very small. But it's not how much they're losing. It's where they're losing it from. Their apostasy rates are all coming from the elite section. So they're losing their elites and they're maintaining their middle and their lower IQ members. So essentially, the evangelical movement has its brains cut out from under it every single generation. And that's a disaster. Any successful post-left movement starts with a story about how it maintains and creates new intellectual and artistic elites. Without that, you don't have a movement. Without that, you have a phone bank of grannies, retirees, and boomers that put pressure on their local dog catcher and school board to hold back a tide of transgenderism and other crazy ideas that come from the left that are all cooked up on elite levels. That will have no chance of working. It will buy you time, but once more, unless you have a story about how you create a new intellectual elite, that's not going to happen. The time is going to be used for nothing more than building on a foundation of sand. And with that, I hope that I've thoroughly dissolved this controversy between academic agent Don the Pleb and whatnot. So with that, okay, guys, I guess here's the moment of truth. I'm going to take some time to read the lost questions that were in the super chat from last time and got mulled over. I think it probably would be better for people watching right now if I took on the questions from the super chat itself and then moved on to the lost questions at the very end of the video, because the probability of the people who ask those questions watching at the time that this goes live is probably very slim. That's my general instinct. If that's what people want, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to general questions. I'm going to read them, and then I'm going to at the very end, I'm about 20 minutes before the end of this live stream, I'm going to essentially put a stop to answering I'm going to say, just guys, stop super chatting me if you guys are actively super chatting me. And I'm going to go on answering the questions that were flushed down the Google rabbit hole last time my stream was interrupted. Okay, so before we get on to the questions that are in the entropy window, there were a few that came before we went live, and when I hit refresh, a few questions by the YouTuber Last Things kind of got lost. I can't actually project them on the screen, but I hope you guys forgive me and will allow you to just read them into the camera. Okay, so here we go. So Last Things, for everyone who doesn't know, Last Things is a new reactionary YouTuber. Everyone should subscribe to his channel because he makes really, really good videos. Only has 2 of them, but he's off to a really good start. So I highly recommend looking up Last Things. But he has some fun questions for me right now. So his first question is, don't keep us in suspense, brah. What 40k army have you started collecting? Well, actually, I think I will keep you in suspense. I might answer this question at the end of the live stream. Actually, I should tell a story. So I was sort of resisting. I had painted some models for role-playing games. I play board games, so I always used to do this. So I had sort of a collection of paints and glue and all the stuff you use to make models. If people follow my Instagram feed, I recently got a box of keepsakes that was sent to a wrong location, and inside of it was my great uncle's gold watch from 100 years ago. Some religious artifacts, some rosaries, and a few other things from my past that were really kind of fun to sort through. And among them were like these little Monty Python miniatures that I had painted up about 10 years ago when I was in college. So I had all of this this model making stuff lying around, and COVID happened, and around summer, I think it was, I got super burnt out on politics. At that stage, I was getting some free time again, and I was making more videos. I kind of had come back to making videos. In fact, I had made an entire 2-hour video that I never released and probably will never release. Maybe I'll just release it to the channel as a throwaway video. It was about academics and the problems with academics. And I released it as an unlisted video, and I was just really, really, really unsatisfied with this video. I think this was around the time I released my video on New Atheism. And I was kind of frustrated with that, and I was feeling really burnt onto politics. So I'm like, okay, I need a hobby that's quiet, that I can do when the baby is sleeping. And, it's going to get my mind off of politics. And so I was searching around on eBay, and I saw all of these used Warhammer miniature models. And I realized at the time, so Warhammer it's a war game. You make your own models and play it on a board. And a lot of reactionaries really love this game because the 40k universe is super reactionary, and it's super fun to be in the lore. And I've been into the lore for as long as I can remember. And in fact, Morgoth has made more than one reactionary reviews of the Warhammer lore. So I'm like, oh, well, it's going to be really, really fun if I use my painting supplies to paint up these models. So my philosophy was, I hate Games Workshop. I hate Wizards of the Coast. Different companies, but same problem. They're going woke, and I really don't want to give any money to them. So I was like, okay, I'll be super big-brained about this whole process. I realized that Games Workshop had just discontinued one of its older games in a fantasy variety. Because of that, all of these models were going on to the eBay marketplace, and you could pick up these old fantasy models for basically 10% of the values that they came new on the box from Games Workshop. Um, and I'm like, oh wow, I got an idea. How about I just buy everything used? I take these old fantasy models, and all I have to do is and this sort of giving you a hint to what army I'm collecting. All I have to do is take these old models, cut off their arms, put futuristic weapons on them, and they're immediately 40k models. And so I was feeling really, really original and smart, and like I pulled one over on Games Workshop. And so, I had this sort of art project that was ongoing throughout the summer. It was a really, really great way to take my mind off of politics because I was getting super depressed. Not super depressed, obviously, but I was getting down on politics, right? How depressed can you be with a wonderful family? I guess COVID lockdowns were kind of getting to me a little bit too at that time. And so after a few months of working on this and buying these great deals on eBay, I was well on my way to getting something like you could play on a tabletop with a very minimal amount of investment and almost no money going to Games Workshop. These were all used, and I was really proud of myself. Then Christmas time came around, and my wife's obviously aware that I'm into this hobby, and so she literally goes to a Games Workshop store, walks in, and the good Lord loved this woman. She goes up to the Games Workshop sales representative and goes, "My husband's really into this Warhammer 40k game. Do you have anything you can sell me from the Warhammer 40k game?" And the salesperson's like, "Well, we might have some models from that Warhammer 40k we could sell you." Long story short, because of that, I did end up paying a fair penny to Games Workshop in spite of myself. So I guess I'll reveal it at the end of this live stream. But the army I'm collecting is something that is an older one. You could convert it from older models without spending on any new ones. So that's my funny story. I hope I see people saying 40k is degenerate. Yeah, I know board games are degenerate. You got me. I'm a board game player. I guess a lot of other people are play board games as well. I know Academic Agent does. As far as I'm concerned, hobbies are fine, and I like working with my hands, which is essentially what it is working with your hands, Buying tools and buying hardware stuff is a huge weakness for me. And so any hobby that requires you go to a hardware store and buy stuff and make stuff out of it and use drills and stuff like that is really up my alley. So, I don't know. That's a stupid question. So thank you guys for humoring me in that. But the more serious questions, last thing asked is, you once said in 1980s, Reagan-Thatcher era was one of the most naive and short-sighted political eras of all time. How so? Would you care to elaborate on this point further? Okay, well, the 1980s Reagan and Thatcher era was one of the most naive political eras of all time because it convinced a generation of people who were dissatisfied with how this country was going culturally that somehow, by being super concerned about the percentage of taxes and the amount of money going to government programs, that they could sort of fundamentally turn around the country that was being led by its nose culturally. This is something that you could see so for instance, Ronald Reagan was a reaction to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter, I couldn't think of a better representative of progressive Christian cultural change more than I could Jimmy Carter. I believe that by the time Jimmy Carter was elected, or I guess he was elected over Ford, after the whole Watergate scandals took down the Republican administration, I think Nixon and the people surrounding Nixon, and I know a few people in Academic Agent's community have pointed this out. The people in the Nixon White House had a much more fundamental understanding of what the New Left was and what it had to be fought. Nixon himself and people like Pat Buchanan, who cut their teeth in the Nixon administration, understood that what they were fighting was an elite movement. It was a movement that had cultural and that had educational roots, and that if those cultural roots were not confronted and defeated, that they would eventually overwhelm any kind of broad anti-communist political coalition that could be pieced together by Reagan or Thatcher or any one of these people. That's what Nixon realized. Somehow, by the time 1980 rolled around, Reagan had turned all of those Nixon intellectuals on to the idea that if we simply opposed communism on an international scale and opposed high marginal tax rates on the domestic scale, all of the cultural changes undergone in the 60s and 70s could be rolled back, and there would be some kind of American Renaissance, and there would be mourning in America. And for a while, it seemed like this was working. The left's cultural gains did not stop, but they seemed to, in mainstream culture, for a while, they seemed to kind of recede. This was, however, almost completely lost by the mid-1990s. The left had recaptured all of their losses they had taken in the 80s. And it was quite apparent at that stage, and this was sort of the point at which Pat Buchanan broke with the Republican Party. It was very apparent that the priorities of the Republican Party were basically just their dinner classes with some complaints, some cultural complaints from the political right stapled on. And I don't, if that's not naive, I'm not so sure what is. They essentially allowed the consolidation of the media and the academy to go on more or less unopposed in this time. And that's sort of the story of the Reaganite and Thatcher era. Reagan and Thatcher, Pat Buchanan realized that if you wanted a symbolic issue, immigration was that symbolic issue. Because immigration was simultaneously allowing the left to preserve their coalition, even though they were slowly losing the white working class. A symbolic issue was not the percentage of the top marginal tax rate, or how much military spending was given in order to push Gorbachev's base further and further down into the mud of an already rapidly dissolving Communist Party. That was not the real battle against the left in America. And Reagan, while he was able to get concessions from the left wing on the confrontation of communism and on tax rates, conceded to the really meaningful cultural issues that were going on. Reagan essentially normalized the racial spoil system. He essentially allowed for amnesty, number one, and he did nothing to confront the large immigration rates coming in from the rest of the world that had been normalized post-1965. So we essentially allowed the left's cultural power and elite power dynamic to consolidate while not having any plan for how to preserve Republican dominance at the level of the middle class. Last things, for his last chat, thank you very much. What are your thoughts on the modern divorce rates? My progressive friends think it's a good thing. People can now be honest and leave unhappy dysfunctional relationships. I think modern people are simply more narcissistic and selfish. How can it be helpful? Well, to my knowledge, we really have to understand two phenomena that are going on here, right? So no-fault divorce became a thing in the 1950s, I believe. It certainly was a fait accompli in the 1960s. And so by the early 1960s, the Mad Men era, divorce rates just skyrocketed. And this was really the era of divorce. You could see sort of the bonds that divorce was trying to describe being loosened all throughout the 70s and the 80s. And then when you get into the 90s, the divorce rate kind of levels off and sinks. The divorce rate is sinking right now because the marriage rate is sinking right now. And in my opinion, the marriage rate is sinking in part. There's a lot of reasons why the marriage rate is sinking. The relationships between the sexes have completely been devastated post-2012. But the marriage rate, in a more broad perspective, is sinking because people's total number of close friends in real life is precipitously dropping. I wouldn't imagine that you could boil down modern pathologies. So in personality and psychology studies, they have these, and you mentioned it last things in the super chat. They have these. So when you do a lot of psychological studies, you can correlate these with other psychological measurements. It's kind of like G in IQ studies. G is an emergent statistic, meaning that it correlates, every single study is correlated with a G. So we see that all the studies move in these common directions, and they're all correlated with this measurement called G. And so G becomes a very, very predicted artificial statistic for predicting how people generally behave on intelligent measuring tests. And similarly in psychology, you derive these sort of artificial statistics. You do a lot of psychological tests on a lot of different people, and you realize that the results are all correlated, and you can reduce some observational qualities to more fundamental qualities that can be derived. And this is where you get sort of the big 5 personality traits or the dark triad traits. And so the dark triad traits are sort of 3 qualities that you see emerge again and again and again in highly pathological individuals. And I think it's like narcissism, Machiavellianism, and sociopathy. So it's something like self-love, an ability to use others for your own end, and not caring about what other people think or negative consequences that happen to them. And these are sort of the traits that are ordinarily associated with criminal behavior, either at a high IQ level or at a low IQ level. I think there's something like the dark triad. I don't think people have done this yet. There's something like that of the dark triad when it comes to population statistics. And I think that's what's driving modern low marriage rates. I think what's happening is the general cohesion in society, and I'm just making up this number, but I would imagine that this dark trait of societies is something along the lines of Robert Putnam's social cohesion, right? People in the West are becoming much, much less sociable with each other. And because of that, this is being caused by some implicit effect in our collectivity that's causing people to become more narcissistic on a personal level. And it's also causing people to marry less and develop less friendships on an interpersonal level. We need to figure out what is causing this effect collectively or in smaller communities, and we need to crack down on it hard. Because right now, the problem is not the divorce rates. The problem is the lack of marriage rates. Maybe I'm not answering your question directly, first things, but to me, it's definitely... targeting divorce rates is sort of closing the barn door after the horse already ran out. The issue of no-fault divorce, that was the problem that kicked it all off in the 1950s. I'm not so sure illegalizing divorce or getting rid of no-fault divorce would cause the problem to fix itself right now. What we need to understand at a sociological level is what causes people to bond to tightly knit communities. How can this be manufactured both at a local scale and at a large societal scale? And what policies procure this outcome? I imagine that the answers to these questions are going to result in us getting a lot of not PC answers. If the right wing or if the post-left can learn these answers and employ them in our own communities faster than the left can, we would have a tactical advantage going forward, both building tight-knit elite communities as the kind that I'm interested in, or perhaps in building broader political movements at a more local red state level, the way that Don the Pleb and Yiz the Eunuch are talking about. So my recommendation would be to refocus you onto that. Okay, we have a lot of super chats, so hopefully I can answer them all in the order that they've come in. Okay, Aristocratic Owls, for $5 USA, just asked me a question. I'm so sorry, man. This is for $5. Very generous. Thoughts on Yarvin's latest post on 21st century censorship? Well, my thoughts are that I've gotten 3 paragraphs in because it was released about 4 hours ago by my count, or at least I saw it 4 hours ago. And my reaction to it is it's hitting at the right problem. The right problem is that we are in the midst of a progressive religion, conquest by a progressive religion that does not want to name itself. There is this great friend I had on Discord that I think I still kind of am in contact with him on Telegram. He's this guy called Society Man, and he wrote an article for my blog back in the day. And his he wrote another blog post that we never got around to publishing about the very famous website Stuff White People Like. And this was a blog that was essentially reviewing stuff that elite hipsters liked, and it called them white people. And for a very, very long time, Stuff White People Like was a synonym for this group of aspiring Brahmins. Urbanite white people, although they're not always white these days, but they're uniformly progressive, that nonetheless they do not like being described. I can highlight this here. This is what Yarvin's getting at, and this is the kind of satire that reactionaries need to participate in. When Stuff White People Liked came out, it was universally condemned as being sort of anti-white racism, which it kind of was. It was a mean-spirited take on white people. And but at the same time, it was lauded by progressives as being something that called out white privilege. As a matter of fact, it's just this kind of diagnosis and understanding of the progressive community as a community that is so thoroughly needed. Once the religion of wokeness can be named, it can be confronted. Once the religion of political correctness can be understood as a thing into itself, it's very easy to see that when everyone kneels at the beginning of a football game, as opposed to stands for the national anthem, they are essentially replacing the old nationalist religion with a new civic religion of wokeness. That visibility is key to any kind of post-left movement we would care to engage in. I see Perplexity has a question right here, but I feel sort of obligated to go to the super chats first. Or to the super chats on Entropy first. I'll get to the ones on YouTube in a bit. And I believe it is... Oh, good Lord. Is it already 11 o'clock? It is. Well, we've got between an hour and a half to get through all of these things. So, forgive me. Okay, so Nerve AMV Maker for $15. Have you read the book Night of the Hunter by David Grubb or seen the film made by Charles Langton? I love the film Night of the Hunter. It is one of my all-time favorite movies, and I will definitely make a video about it sometime in the future. At my current rate of making videos, it's going to take me a long time to get to that, but that's something that I really want to write about in the broader context of a genre called Southern Gothic. I love Southern Gothic media. I think it is a core to understanding the individual culture of America. And I think Night of the Hunter is one of the prime examples of the Southern Gothic form. It was a movie that was so misunderstood during its time. Audiences didn't like it when it came out because it was some strange cross between a sort of regionalist period piece about the Great Depression and also a horror movie. And it's just bizarre. I don't know how to explain its charm because in some ways it's kind of hokey. In some ways it's kind of a very direct story. But in other ways it is just beautiful. The symbolism pours out of every single scene in that movie. And it's even based on a real story, strangely enough. But yeah, I'll definitely comment on that Nerve AMV Maker. I'm not so sure how much I have to say about it right now, unfortunately. I'm going to kind of go on. Yeah. NBC Broadcasting for $5. Dave is the quintessential neckbeard purist. Well, yeah, I guess for a 20-hour period, I was literally the neckbeard purist. I had nothing but a neckbeard. That's kind of an embarrassing story, but I guess it was more the fault. I think maybe the problem was I had pulled the face mask over my neck, so the guy couldn't see it. I mean, it's just bizarre. I wonder why he trimmed my hair that way. It was really bizarre. Okay, I guess that's all of the super chats we have here. There's a lot on. Oh wow, there are a lot on Google. Okay, so I guess how I'm going to do this is I'm going to read up from the super chats here, and then I'm going to eventually get to the ones that are contained inside the ones that are just in Google because I didn't answer them last time. Okay, so starting out from Count Gilroy for $10. Geez, is there any hope for us at all? Oh yeah, there's tons of hope. You know, I mean, the left is really, really, really weak. I mean, it's kind of ridiculously weak when you think about it. They're comprised of people at this stage who are just dealing with serious mental health issues. When you look at somebody like ContraPoints, you're looking at somebody, not really for the whole transgenderism thing, but for the substance abuse thing. This is a person who, in their private media messages, has admitted to several times having serious, self-induced, potentially life-destroying substance abuse problems. And this is the symbol of the left on YouTube. This is the role model of the left on YouTube. And they're buttressed by some combination of people who are having psychological problems or who are just running a straight-up grift. Vosh at this stage transparently does not believe in any principles that he talks about. I guess Vosh, like the Amazing Atheist, is just buttressed by an unending tower of middle-brow intellects not even middle-brow, just plain idiots and teenagers who think that they're the savior of the man-childs, basically. That they're the prophet of the new age of people who need not do anything other than gratify themselves and play video games. And that this can be translated into
garbage bins.
Okay. My wife had a comment there. This can be translated into something that will be useful in the future. I just don't see how this can be sustainable. I don't see how that this can be sustainable in any amount of a time. And I think that what is the market for people who actually want to have honest conversations about the world? What is the market for people who actually want to have art that isn't just being a spoon feeding of general woke points about things? That space is just fertile ground as far as I can tell. I can't not be hopeful when I see this. I know that Edward Dutton, I caught a little bit of this live stream. I didn't catch all of it, but I caught a little bit of it. And this was a conversation between Edward Dutton and Blonde from Blonde in the Belly of the Beast, who now has transferred her channel to just doing interviews, which is, good enough. And he was talking about how progressivism, the way it would destroy itself, is that there would very, very slowly be an infiltration of post-leftists at the elite level. And this would eventually push out people who were destroying themselves very, very slowly until there was a revolution in the opposite direction. The symbol for political movements being feasible is the existence of an elite vanguard. that is tightly knit and that is coming up with new ideas. Before that, though, I don't think that there really is a point in having a political movement. I mean, I don't know. Again, if you want to obtain victories at a very, very local level, I think that's very, very laudable. But I don't see that this is going to translate into anything larger when it comes to striking back at the progressive cultural change until there is some kind of an elite vanguard that can represent ideas at a more nuanced level higher up. So 2020 is a lame year for $5. Well, thank you very much. Looking good. I'm digging the clean shaven look. Yeah, this is. I kind of like this. I just shaved. I feel like I look bald here. But I don't know. I kind of like the beard. I think my wife liked the beard a little bit too. Oh my God, I guess I can't highlight Google Chats, so I apologize for that. You'll just have to stand for me reading these things out on the screen. But thank you. 2020 is a lame year. Maybe I'll keep the clean shaven look. I'm getting kind of mixed results on this from the chat. Simon Laplace for NT75. The distributors just explained to us Ishmael, the psychic gorilla's main idea, but for right-wingers. We need a new story for the future or we will all just die. Now, I actually got that reference if no one else from the chat did. So Ishmael is a story, I think it was written in the 1980s. It's this really weird kind of, it must have been a pretty early story, right? It must have been the 70s, right? Because I seem to remember this being written about in Putnam's The Illuminatus trilogy. I feel like there was a reference to this, but it was one of the early texts of deep environmentalism. And so the general plot is this person he's interviewing this psychic gorilla that is communicating to him the way the animals see humans. And the message of Ishmael is that humanity is not divided so much into... Ishmael, the psychic gorilla, communicates to the narrator that the enemy is human culture, writ large, just human culture. And humanity is not divided so much into producers and takers, but really into takers and leavers. Nature produces everything, and humanity, the good people in humanity are the people that leave things behind for the next generation, and the bad humans are the ones that take things. There is the farming mentality that was developed in the Industrial Revolution is fundamentally a product of this evil human culture. And it's fundamentally distorting our view on how things actually work. I think what's communicated at the end of Ishmael is that environmentalism needs to become the new environmentalism and not conservationism needs to be the new perspective that the left needs to take. Otherwise, the planet is doomed. Now, I think from a purely conservationist point of view, I don't really think deep environmentalism has done much. I think that the politicization of the environment and it's being transformed from a conservationist movement to a religious movement has been fundamentally disastrous for the environment itself. But for the political prospects of the left, it has been absolute gold. In the time that global warming has been turned from a political, or I should say an engineering problem, to a political problem, to a religious movement with its own prophets, like Al Gore and Greta Thunberg, they've been able to essentially turn a question of risk, benefit, and cost into a way where they can morally browbeat everyone until they concede to any given policy. A really great example of this is Thought Slime's. I know, I watched BreadTube. So I had the misfortune of watching Thought Slime's latest video. And so Thought Slime's latest video was It was against money. Yeah, a really galaxy brain take here. So Thought Slime hates money, but still donate to his Patreon. Don't forget to hit that subscribe. Don't forget to super chat his next live stream, but he hates money. It's the cause of all evils. And not only is money bad, but Bitcoin is bad. And his big brain take here is Bitcoin is the same thing as cash. People who make money speculating on are vampires, and you should all ditch Bitcoin because it's destroying the environment. Well, I mean, he does have, first of all, he completely misses the point. He completely broadcasts his lack of understanding about how Bitcoin works. He completely communicates a lack of understanding of the utility of money. I noticed that he's not accepting donations via barter economy. No one's able to give him eggs or food or computer parts that he needs. That's not a way. You can't support Thought Slime that way. But what was sort of fascinating about this is that it's obvious that the left, for its political purposes, does not like cryptocurrency. Okay, so how can you sell abolish cryptocurrency to anarchists like Thought Slime? Because on the face of it, cryptocurrency is great. Thought Slime hates capitalism. What is money? Well, money is just a piece of paper that represents a resource, which anarchists should be fine with, right? Because you need some way of giving people eggs without actually sending eggs in the mail. And you need some form of promissory note. Well, except, money isn't that. Money currently is not a representation of a resource. Money currently is just a promise made by a bank. So money is fiat currency made by capitalists, which should be everything that an anarchist like Thought Slime on paper should object to. So how is the woke left, the woke global capitalist left, how is their opposition to cryptocurrency going to dovetail with Thought Slime's opposition to cryptocurrency, right? We need to get the activist class on the same page as the globalist class. Well, global warming, right? Cryptocurrency takes electricity. Electricity is bad for the environment. Cryptocurrency takes a lot of electricity. Therefore, it's really bad for the environment. And so, of course, Thought Slime says you can't use cryptocurrency because it's literally killing the planet. Of course, do you know what else takes a lot of processor time? The internet writ large, video games, the financial system as it exists, transactions and shipping things globally. If you buy a computer and it has parts in Asia, that also takes a lot of energy. Cryptocurrency in its present form, I would say, is much too much energy consuming for our own good. And if this becomes more mainstream, there will have to be an engineering solution, of which there do exist. But as a general usage of the total global energy supply, I think it comes in at less than 1%, which is a lot to be sure. But I don't notice Thought Slime being against video games because they consume energy in toto. I don't see Thought Slime not using cash because it uses energy in toto. I don't see Thought Slime boycotting products from China because it uses energy in toto. And so you realize that this global warming thing is only selectively used so that the globalists can keep their activist base in line. This is also very much on display when Noam Chomsky was having conversations with those deep BLM activists. They all wanted to be anti-democratic party. Did Noam Chomsky have to come up with some very, very intricate political theory about how Joe Biden was secretly a based anarchist? No, he didn't. All he had to say was two words: global warming. Global warming, vote for Biden. Global warming, vote for Biden. That's all he said again and again and again. He had to have Biden was actually more in favor of expanding the war in Syria than Donald Trump was. All of Chomsky's career, for the most part, was in opposition to new Middle Eastern wars. But of course, that can be dispensed with by just saying global warming. Does global warming stop Chomsky from owning stocks? No. Does global warming stop Chomsky from taking trips to Europe? No. Does global warming stop Chomsky from importing French wine? No. But it keeps everyone voting for Joe Biden. So I know I've digressed a lot from this question. I don't even. What I want to say is that Ishmael was a book that essentially helped the transformation of environmentalism from genuine resource conservation to a religious movement. And that has been an untold utility for holding the left together. I wonder if global warming is going to continue to be this thing that holds the left together. In some sense, I can't imagine it going on, but I also can't imagine it stopping. Well, oh my God. Alex Ashley for $2, and I forgot to say this. Happy Holy Week, everyone. Happy Holy Week. I think I actually might do a stream on Thursday night with my wife where we just say a rosary. I probably won't keep the stream up on my channel, but I really want to mark this Easter season as us completely reestablishing our religious practice. I'm just, I think that this just needs to happen. Our religious practice has been intermittent at best in the times in between last March and where we are right now. Yeah, Holy Week is a very special time for us. It's kind of funny. The resurrection, the crucifixion, the Last Supper, it should be something that you celebrate every single week. But something about the pattern of the year itself, every Holy Week, my wife said this and I kind of want to reiterate her emotion, every Holy Week kind of brings me to tears in a lot of ways. I don't know, it's a special time. It's not as easy to express as Christmas time is. I think every secular person is kind of imbued with the aesthetics of Christmas time, even if they are not connected with the religion itself. Easter is harder. I don't know what aesthetics are proper in Easter. And I think somehow fundamentally, secular Christmas nailed the feeling of religious Christmas. It's a time of homecoming and celebration and relief and joy and friends and family. Easter, on the other hand, is a season of repentance and renewal and a certain amount of hardship and a coming clean. That's not something that the secular mind has really been trained to understand. But it's something that the secular mind, I think, is going to need to understand to get to the next level. I wonder if we can't find a way of communicating the spiritual force of Easter while speaking in a language that can be understood by the secular world. I'm not sure that it exists. It's easy to imagine Christmas as a pagan. It's hard to imagine Easter. Because Easter isn't equinox. It's much less like the spring holiday of midsummer or equinox is much, much different than the celebration of Easter. And I don't think you can really have Easter without Christ being an explicit presence in the same way. I still think that there are threads you can pull on, though. But yes, again, thank you, Alex Ashley. And I will hopefully keep the community in my prayers. Do you see the Manosphere red pill as Simon Laplace for NT75 again. Do you see the Manosphere red pill as a potential political ally against progressivism, harnessing male sexual energy into a practical political movement? Well, I hate to say it, but I really kind of yes and no. The manosphere is fine if you want to move from the manosphere to a reactionary political movement. But the problem is it's so fundamentally broken. The difficulty is, it tends to attract more broken people, and that's fine. I get it. It tends to attract more broken people. B, its aesthetics are horrible. The manosphere are comprised of 3 groups, each with their own terrible problems. The first one are the pickup artists. Second people are the men's rights activists. And the third people are the MGTOW. Okay, let's start in that order. Pickup artists, by their very nature, are essentially trying to exploit a system rather than fix its problems. I guess in some sense, because they're so obviously cynical, they're therefore sometimes the easiest to reach. And Roosh would be a good example of this. But I'm sorry, before you explicitly stop exploiting the problem and start trying to actually fix the problem, you're essentially just being a grifter, right? I mean, that's it. I mean, maybe you don't reap your grift in terms of monetary reward. Maybe you reap your grift in terms of sexual conquests. But you're essentially just doing a vash, and you're essentially just trying to exploit the situation of people being depressed and on the fritz rather than actually trying to do something about it collectively. And our problem has origins that are collective and spiritual. They don't have the problems that we're facing in the sexual dynamic are not that there aren't enough Lotharios out there trying to exploit the situation. And if there aren't enough native Lotharios trying to exploit the situation, I'm sure that we'll be able to import enough Lotharios from the third world to fill that quota. So I'm pretty sure that's not an actual solution. So, okay, cynical grifters, probably not going to be a source of energy without repentance, but maybe repentance is possible. Let's go on to the men's rights activists. And I am somebody who does admire Karen Strawn in a lot of ways. She was one of the first YouTube red pillars out there, and she made great video essays. And she spoke very, very frankly in a way that was very, very hard for the left to confront. No judgment there whatsoever. What's the big problem? Well, it's more or less the same problem as the Constitution conservatives. There's no point in invoking a right against the issuer of that right. It's even worse than Constitution, because at least the Constitution was a set of rights that was granted to the American people at some point in the past, ostensibly by the same political body that wants obedience from us in the present year. So presumably, under classical Christian notions of rule by law, there should be some kind of relationship there, right? Of course, that Christian rule of law is abrogated by a nation that's no longer Christian. That being said, I can forgive that. Men's rights activists are unfortunately, their delusions even further. Their delusion on rights goes to the UN Charter on rights. Here you're trying to, actually it's worse than the UN Charter of Rights. UN Charter of Rights are a statement of rights against a political body that was never sovereign to begin with. Men's rights activists are trying to create rights without even a sovereign entity that has ever guaranteed these rights or could possibly guarantee these rights into the future. It's petitioners without any hope of a petition being answered. It's people coming and pleading at the throne of a power structure that thrives off of that specific group's disenfranchisement. The only route for men's rights activists is to realize that trying to claim rights against a system whose political formula functions on denying your rights is pretty much ridiculous to begin with and should never be pursued. The other problem with men's rights activists is men's rights activists even if we were to grant that they could invoke rights to get their way out of men's problems, if we were just simply to go in and reform the divorce laws and make men and women shelters more equitable and reform feminism from the ground up in the way that people like Karen Strong might want, we still wouldn't have confronted a lot of the pathological sexual dynamics that entered into the sexual revolution. There was a time after the sexual revolution and before feminism. That time was the early 1960s. That was a horrible time to be a woman, in my opinion, because you were essentially exploited. The solution, if we grant men's the problem that needs fixing is the fact that men and women have no equitable and trust-based way of interacting with each other. It's not that one sex doesn't have rights. If your husband can divorce you at 30, with minimal amount of alimony and no support, and you have 3 kids and you can't get a new husband, and you're a divorcee, and that doesn't mean anything, and we're in a culture that isn't set up for that. That's not a comfortable situation to be in as a woman. And a lot of women found themselves in that situation in the early 1960s. If the bonds of marriage, if that promise can be broken, if that sacramental bond can be broken, I'm not sure that any right that man asks for against the state is something that's ever going to be respected. Certainly not any kind of rights as men or women can be respected. So the only path for the men's rights activists is to quickly realize that rights are stupid and useless unless some kind of healthy dynamic between the sexes is formed in terms of some kind of relationship form that benefits both of them in a long-term capacity. And also whether we have some kind of collective spiritual dynamic that can actually inspire some sovereign entity to make promises and keep those promises. And what forces a sovereign entity to keep those promises cannot be a previous promise made by said sovereign entity. If I haven't said that enough, a promise made by a sovereign entity cannot be the force that strikes fear into the sovereign entity itself. That runs into the classic problem of who watches the watchers. It has to be some higher and deeper motivating force, something moral, aesthetic, or spiritual. If you look into human history, the only things that have kept monarchs in line, the only basis of initial law, has not been, if you hear this bullshit from libertarians all the time, you hear this especially from Western libertarians, men came together and formed a contract of rights, and that was the first government. Bullshit. Men never came together and said, oh guys, let's all start hitting each other. That has never happened. Never happened in the history of human civilization. What happened was that a bunch of strong men beat everyone up and made themselves leaders. And they, in turn, were kept in check by a fear of some larger spiritual entity. As G.K. Chesterton put it, the first laws that strong men came up with is that you and I must not hit each other in the holy place. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, maybe you could argue that religious perspective, that religious inclination, was due to some kind of larger group selection that was going on. But that is, rights do not come ex nihilo from rational men. They are derived from religious emotions that are experienced by rulers, and the covenant those rulers make both with their people and with the larger spiritual experience that they're having. That is the evidence that we see from the Hebrew scriptures. That is the evidence we see from older religious testaments from almost all cultures. So, okay, that being dispensed, I'm really taking a digression here. MGTOW. I mean, this is kind of the most problematic community. In some sense, there's the least things wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with going your own way. And in some sense, they realized one of the core elements of relationships between men and women. In order for men to be desirable to women, they cannot have their lives revolve around women. In order to pursue something, you need to hold it lightly, and you need to be able to walk away from sex, even if you want to pursue sex in a correct way. If you look at Old Testaments of manliness, be they either the Christian code of Bushido or the Buddhist code of Bushido. That sounded weird. The Buddhist code of Bushido sounded weird. Or even something as old as the Epic of Gilgamesh. Everywhere you will see core to male ethics is an ability to control their sexual appetite and an ability to walk away from it at any time. In some sense, MGTOW is the most based of all of these manosphere philosophies. In reality, though, in practice, it's the worst one. By far. Because in practice, I don't know how they've done it. MGTOW has not created... if MGTOW was being done correctly, it would have created a whole class of ascetic monks, of men that are totally independent-minded, who never think about sex, and are only focused on creating great things. Hey, maybe it's only being really good at StarCraft, or painting a Warhammer army, if you're inclined to do that. Or maybe it's writing the great American novel, or maybe it's prayer or physical fitness, or any one of these inclinations. For the most part, people like Stardust, notwithstanding, obviously, who's a genuinely deep soul. But for the most part, the MGTOW community, as you experience them online and in the comment section, is not a bunch of monks or a bunch of heroic ascetics taking control of their own desires, either to pursue them or to deny them absolutely. It's a bunch of bitter people who have eschewed dating real women so that they can masturbate to fake women online, and who are so subsequently enthralled to these sexual fantasies that it has kept them perpetually in a state of bitterness, to the point where they come on to every single other person's channel and constantly comment on how their own endeavors are going to fail. 4 years ago, in 2016, the first year my channel started, I made a video about Turd Flinging Monkey and MGTOW. Every day, or every other day, I still get a comment on that video by upset MGTOW telling me about how I'm going to get raped by the divorce courts. Well, maybe. I'll regret starting a family at some point, but it's been 4 years and that hasn't happened. And the fact that these people are digging up 4-year-old videos with how biased the YouTube algorithm already is should tell you something about the mentality of these people. MGTOW is not actually delivering on the promise of men going in their own way, and for that reason I have very little hope in it. Okay, so at this point, guys, just don't give me new super chats. I'm going to get to the end of the super chats that I have here currently, and I'm going to hopefully get to the end of all the ones that I missed last time. I see new super chats. I guess they're coming in through Google. Okay, pardon me. Okay, so we have one from the Wooster for $5. Have you read any of Michael Welbeck's? It's pronounced Welbeck, I think. Welbeck, yeah. Even though it looks like Hollaback. Have you read any of Michael Welbeck's work? He has a book about analyzing H.P. Lovecraft, saying that horror is inherently reactionary. Oh my God. Well, I have to read that one. I think I read... did I read Submission? If I did, it was a long time ago. I see that someone in the chat saying that I lucked out and got one of the 3 marriageable women left in the West. Well, a bunch of my friends got married too in the same time period, so it must not be that bad. Maybe I should do a stream about finding women. Look, I know as an older millennial, I really did feel like I lucked out because I saw the dating market essentially crash in my own lifetime. Around 2014, the dating market went from being bad, and it was worse than it was in the early 2000s, to being absolutely deplorable in the 2010s. I don't envy any millennial man who's younger than me in the marriage market currently, but there are things you can do to improve your lot. And, I just don't think that this manosphere stuff is really doing that. Okay, I'm going to return to entropy and see if there's any more chance there. I don't see any. Okay, so one of the questions from Perplexity. As an NRX pro artist, I'm having trouble finding meaningful work to contribute. With the Canaan Society and indefinite hiatus and doxing rampant, any advice on how to connect with other culture builders IRL? Well, IRL is a little difficult at this stage because we're kind of locked down. Have you tried Fiverr? I've been looking for somebody to do a new icon for me, and I want to use a service through Fiverr. I think that making social media pages for professional stuff is just a necessity at this stage. I'm going to have to look into how we could manage this going forward. It's not easy. Yeah, my sympathies, Perplexity. I'm sorry, is that a super chat? I hope I'm seeing these things. I'm always afraid that I'm going to miss some actual donation super chat. Watching two systems has not changed this at all. So for artists, for the time being, the only way anyone has to sell their labor is to go through ordinary channels, which at this point are social media. I want to see if we can't hire internally for people who are doing, post-leftist projects. This is always hard because, if there's 3 artists that are right-wing, and you don't like what they do, you don't think it's a well-suited fit for what you're trying to do, it's not a good idea to bend your output to what they're producing. But that being said, there should be a way that you can look for them first. So, I don't know. I hope that wasn't a super chat because I'm not giving a very long answer to that, but I'm going to go on to the older... I'm going on to the older chats now. Oh, I see Pater for 100 rupees. Thank you very much. It's just a pure donation, so I appreciate it. Okay, I'm going to refresh the Google page and see if I can't just go back in time. Kind of apologize for this pause and things. Okay, so this is the last one I remember answering in February 22nd. So I'm going to go up from here, and if there's any that I feel are redundant or I answered them in the last stream, you'll forgive me. But at this stage, it's more important for me to read every super chat than for me to miss one, because I really hate to think that people spent money and I'm not answering their question. So for Photon, for €5, hypothetically, if the progressive mainstream wanted to negotiate with the right, what concessions should the dissident right aim for? That's easy. Independent institutions across the board and no harassment of independent institutions. That should be the concession, a recognition of a legitimate non-progressive force that has a right to educate and communicate amongst ourselves. If that concession is made, we will slowly win the culture war. The problem we're dealing with right now is it's very, very, very difficult to be a mainstream cultural creator when the left is constantly taking down your platforms. And the problem is we can't do two things. We can't build a financial base consistently, and we also can't do quality control. Losing Discord for me in hindsight was a major blow to me. Not so much because I love Discord, it wasn't anything special, but I couldn't filter people through Discord. And it was really the loss of the first one that was the big blow, because the Discord server was a way that I could sort people out. I could kind of figure out, okay, this person did this, he's been a long-time member of this community, therefore I trust this person. Or I don't trust this person very much. Losing that took that straight off the table. So what we want is we want to have spaces that we manage where we can very, very slowly build up a group of people that we know we trust. At this stage, the only way I know I trust somebody is if they have a consistent presence online. And for this reason, it helps that they're a content creator in some capacity. And I know that they are exposed enough that they can't just turn around and, throw me under the bus. And even then, we've had some issues with people. And I'm not going to mention those people. So I'd say the concession that we want is independent institutions and an understanding that there's a legitimate perspective that's not progressive. If that concession is granted, then the path to an eventual post-leftist political reality becomes very, very realizable. If that's not granted, then we have a lot more work to do. So, and I think that concession can be granted if we take the right approach to leftists when we encounter them. Bob Obb for $5 says, Jesus' moral legacy is worth defending. Sargon, I think this is addressed to Sargon, even from a totally secular perspective. Well, more to the point, right? And I guess I kind of already beat this perspective into the ground. Why is Jesus worth defending in a way that John Locke isn't, or Thomas Jefferson isn't? Because Thomas Jefferson and John Locke are men who made promises. The only reason those men are now dead. The only reason that their promises had life beyond the existence of their physical forms was because they grounded these promises in a spiritual tradition that was grounded in Christianity and largely the monotheistic moral God. Now that monotheistic moral God has passed from the scene, all Thomas Jefferson and John Locke are rotting corpses that 300 years ago made promises. They're not even necessarily our illustrious genetic ancestors. We can't even use the human inclination for ancestor worship to get to them because most of us are Anglo-Saxons. I am a German, not an Anglo-Saxon, so I'm not even necessarily related to John Locke. We can't use civilizational ancestry, which I certainly have with them, because increasingly the people who are occupying our society aren't even from the Western civilization. And we can't even use a moralistic perspective that this was some kind of golden age, the 18th century, because the Enlightenment is not going to be recognized as a golden age now that we've front and centered the existence of slavery at the same time, which is very intentionally done by the left for just this reason. So all we have really is the shadow of the progressive God and two rotting corpses that are making these promises to us. And not to borrow a quote from Warhammer 40k, but I don't know really how far you can get worshipping a corpse on a gilded throne. which is essentially what we're doing when we enthrone Jefferson, or it's not Jefferson's Constitution, but Jefferson's Bill of Rights and Jefferson's Declaration sans some kind of greater spiritual living entity. Jesus, if his claims are true, is alive. God, if he exists, and I'm very certain some kind of God exists, that is a living entity in our world. It is not some kind of memory or shadow. And I don't think we can build a civilization on the back of a ghost or a corpse. It's that simple. And for that reason, Jesus' moral legacy is worth defending. Locke's is not. Locke's moral legacy was dead the second his ancestors stopped obeying his promise. Because ancestor worship and the worship of a fictional golden age was the only thing that was breathing new life into the words of a dead man. And it's that simple. I feel like I get all my fire for these things right towards the end of these live streams. When you start these things, you kind of are a little bit not very sure-footed to begin with. Okay, so Carmen Miles for $5 USA. What do you think about using these platforms, not for argumentation, but for posting trad and pro-white aesthetics? Well, I mean, there's sort of two forms for this thing. Okay, let's break this down. Because the answer is kind of in two forms. The first thing is, what do you think about using social media to pose good aesthetics? That I'm absolutely for. So, as everyone knows, I deleted Facebook. I have a fake account on Facebook for emergencies. Because you need one, but it's empty, right? It's filled with fake information, and I never post on it or check it. But I completely deleted Twitter. Maybe my wife said maybe you could have a fake Twitter account where I delete my password to it so I can never check it, and it just duplicates my Telegram accounts. I deleted Twitter. I deleted Facebook. I'm trying to get off of Gmail. There is one mainstream media platform that I actually started using that I'm actually kind of comfortable using, and that media platform is Instagram. And all I post on Instagram is pictures that I think reflect my aesthetic. And I don't even post it often. And the reason is that aesthetics is powerful because it can communicate spirituality in a language that the non-believers cannot easily identify as wrongthink. And the aesthetic of cozy, once communicated, even communicated in a mainstream platform, is impossible to fight against by any sort of explicit political actor. What is Thoughtslime going to do? I know that trad posting or posting pictures of things that implicitly communicate a reverence for old civilizational elements and old civilizational fixtures, I know that irritates people on BreadTube. I know they can feel the implicit criticism the past has to their current lifestyles. People on BreadTube, even the globalists who are just plain old shitlibs, these people are afraid of the past. And increasingly, it's becoming obvious that these people are afraid of the past, and that this fear is a more prominent, much more than their accusations that reactionaries were ever afraid of the future. They're afraid of the past because the past critiques them, and the past critiques them for the past's beauty. And true spirituality critiques them through the one force of the spirituality that they can still feel once they've walked away from the substance of the spirituality, once they've walked away from the moralism of the spirituality. And the way they feel the critique is through aesthetics. And for this reason, Instagram, the purely aesthetic mainstream platform, is the only platform that I've felt inclined to keep and that I feel safe communicating on, because I will never communicate politically on that platform. And yet still, it is political. That's the first question. The second question is, what about this pro-white aesthetics, so to speak, right? Well, I mean, this is sort of where I kind of depart from this thing. I don't like the word pro-white. I like the word anti-white. I think it's stronger, and I also don't like the word trad. I know my wife really doesn't like this YouTuber, but Critical Condition, or Robin Riley, really did say it best when she said, "I'm not a trad woman, I'm just not crazy." Once you label things as trad, you're giving a name to yourself, when really the question that any good trad post should be, this is what normal should be like, why aren't you like this? Every good aesthetic post should be, this could be normal, why aren't you like this? But it can't explicitly say this. Every good aesthetic post has to be asking for a label, not for the good aesthetic that's posting it, but for the mainstream culture that's posting everything but it. If that makes sense. Any kind of victory for trad cannot be trad. It has to be not crazy. This picture is not crazy. This picture is sane. This picture is not anti-white. This picture is just beautiful. And why aren't you beautiful? Why aren't you anti-white? Why are you not crazy? Why are you not crazy? Why are you crazy? Is the immediate question that asks itself. And that has to be the immediate communication of an aesthetic. If you name the aesthetic as a movement, it will lose the power it has in the present moment. But that being said, I agree with the super chatter. Bob Obb for $10. It is Jesus' insistence on love as the highest virtue, the most important thing you can glean from the Gospels. I don't think that there is a higher virtue, even in extreme thought experiments. Yes. I mean, yes, absolutely. This is the problem, is because, I can just endorse this tweet in its entirety because everything Bob Obb said here that I read out, I guess you can't see the tweet. I apologize for this because I don't have this set up to share my screen. Everything about love being the greatest virtue as Jesus has preached it is 100% correct. But my role as I see it on YouTube right now, I feel like I have to translate this into secular speak. The love that we're talking about here is neither the romantic love nor the love in which progressive Christianity conceives it. But a love more powerful. A love that's comprised of self-giving and comprised of actually taking a stand for things that are substantive. When you look at Jesus, and this is really important in why people should read the Gospels, and this is something that G.K. Chesterton pointed out, progressive Christianity has a vision of Jesus that is meek and mild. That is not a correct vision of Jesus. He is angry. He is commanding. He is authoritative. He is kind of a giant figure. And yet, even in that authoritative anger, there is a communication of love. And maybe you're just somebody who's not ready to address that sort of spiritual love and that sort of Christian sense of agape. Fair enough. I'll borrow this from a very based secular cartoon. Stone Toss. He released a comic. I should have this comic ready to go, but I didn't know it would be answering this super chat question. I believe the comic was called Turn the Other Cheek. 3 panels. And the first panel is this gay guy going up to a Christian and going, "Don't you know, Christian, that your religion is implicitly homophobic?" And the Christian goes, "Okay, maybe it is." And the next panel is the gay guy sweating and going, but Jesus said not to judge." This is sort of the reflection of the power of turn the other cheek. It is not simply surrender, but it is surrender around a principle. The communication in that panel is that the Christian loves Christianity for being holy and for being true and for being good and for being beautiful and for being godly, for lack of another word, which communicates all those things. Its relationship to a modern word like homophobic is meaningless. Its relationship to a certain kind of idea of what will give you political benefits is meaningless. And once he communicates that love by disregarding the word homophobic, the only response is an implicit concession by the more powerful party to try to play by the rules of Christianity itself. I don't know. If you're some kind of secular right-winger who is of the opinion that Christianity is totally cucked, I mean, just read the early Christian writings and read the works of Jesus. Read the words of Jesus himself. There's nothing cucked about that whatsoever. Lavoisier for $5. Hey, I got a $60 gift card on Amazon. I need to spend. Any book recommendations, preferably nonfiction, history, and philosophy. Okay, so recently on Amazon, I wish I could never had. I have a lot of money on Amazon too that I have to spend, and I hate every second of it. I'm trying to find some way to cut Amazon out of my life. I don't know if it's possible, but I mean, I'm thinking maybe eBay. eBay seems to be a really good way of getting everything these days. I'm thinking of just using eBay for a lot of things. That's what Luke Smith does, after all. I think the last thing I recommended on Amazon was the collection Poetry on Record. Okay, let's actually, I'm going to take I can't quick a break here, it's almost done. I should do a stream on book recommendations that's just book recommendations, but let me give you a few off the top of my head. If you're shopping on Amazon, the best buy you have this month, just recently was released on paperback, is James Burnham's The Machiavellians, a quintessential overview of reactionary thought in the early 20th century in a very readable form. My one quibble is I don't agree with him about Dante. But that being said, excellent author. You can't go wrong. And it's just been released, to my understanding, in trade paperback. If you got this in hardcover, it would be like $300 to $400. So that is a steal. If it's not available in paperback, don't bother shelling out $500. Not that a $60 gift card would get you that. But for the longest time, that book was out of publication and extremely rare. And that is an absolutely great book. As for all book recommendations, it's really hard to know what you've read. And that is a critical issue. I don't know if I've recommended this book, but this is sort of a classic one. After Virtue is really, really good. If you want a more modern political book, Christopher Caldwell's The Age of Entitlement, although it doesn't go far enough, is a really, really good read in the political section. If you want to go deeper philosophy, there's just so many. It's so hard. Like I'm trying to, whenever I'm tempted to give a book recommended list, I think back to that horrible recommended reading list that what's his face gave. He was the guy on the was one of these Catholic apologists, and he wrote a list of like the best books ever. And the best books ever, he had like 20 books, right? And there were like 5 books from G.K. Chesterton and 5 books from like C.S. Lewis. And like a book of apologetics tossed in there. And I looked at the list and I'm thinking, that's insane. That's like holy Catholic bubble. I don't know anything about Lavoisier, so I can't give him books. Is he someone who comes from the Catholic side of things? And therefore I need to give him like the base, like the reactionary stuff? Is he someone who comes from like the reactionary side and I need to give him spiritual books? I always try to answer this by reaching for sort of like the deep cuts more, things that I've been reading more recently. Carl Schmitt's The Concept of the Political, or Political Theology, are things that I've read recently that have been good pickups. Carl Schmitt doesn't write in a way that I find is very readable. I mean, he's better than Thomas Carlyle, right? I'll say that. If you're looking for an old school reactionary author that is very readable and very fun, you can't go wrong with Joseph de Maistre. It reads like a blog. It translates perfectly into English. You can pick up a used paperback for not that much money. Highly recommend that. That being said, Lavoisier, maybe I should just do like a review of the bookshelf, one of these live streams, and I'll spend the entire stream on that. Turner Reeves for $5. To properly flourish, I think we need to understand how dark the situation is. How do we talk to allies who are still hopeful, such as neocons? Well, if you were using neocons in the way that I use neocons, the solution for neocons is to not talk to neocons, because I think they have got some ulterior motives that are not as seemly as I would like. I think a lot of them are ex-Trotskyists that were kind of using the conservative movement as a vehicle. And I have no interests in talking to unrepentant Trotskyists in any capacity. As for, let's say like the MAGA guys. I don't think you should ever be a counsel of despair to anyone. Hope is a virtue. Well, I mean, hope in the Christian concept is a virtue. It's not in the secular concept. It's an emotion in the secular concept. But whenever you're counseling despair, you're essentially counseling a lie. And I don't like that. I don't know. I think if I were to talk to somebody like Don the Pleb, and I wanted to communicate to them, the dilemma that I'm under, I would say something like this. Let's just assume America is over, right? I mean, you keep on saying that we're losing. What happens after someone loses and keeps losing? At some point, they have lost the war, right? Let's say that we have lost the war. Let's just say that the worst is true and America is over. Could you communicate a way of working in our present political system where we essentially have America in concept buried? What really does inspire you? You like the Constitution, sure. But let's say the Constitution is it. What was it about the Constitution that you liked? And is there a way that you could put that in new words and revivify that in your own life? You know, this is something that I think we need to encourage people to get to sort of the core religious element of their own beliefs, rather than still stick on these sort of false political hopes. You know, and this is why I always read literature from the Dark Ages like Boethius. I don't know if I really understand these authors and the time in which they have lived. But authors who lived and worked in the fall of the Roman Empire, despair is sort of a constant presence, but it's not the final word. It just means you need to find a greater hope. And I think the fundamental problem with Don the Pleb is that his political victories, I guarantee this, for the course of his lifetime will be small. The course of my lifetime, the political victories will be small. without large spiritual victories, those small political victories will become overshadowed by a larger cultural defeat. St. Augustine consoled himself by seeing that there is a city of God that would outlast the decline of his own city. He found hope in a larger spiritual hope, even during what could only be construed as a political defeat. And there's a similar consolation in Boethius. I don't think that Don the pleb, or anyone else who follows in his footsteps, is going to be satisfied with a lifetime of snagging elected dog catcher positions, or even necessarily fleshing out a ranch community without a larger spiritual nature that teaches him that his small victories are more meaningful than the larger victories superficially gained by the progressives at a larger level. Yeah, I mean, look at this. I'll just say this to Don the pleb, right? Okay, let's look at this. Compare me to ContraPoints or me to Vosh, right? That's the equivalent of the political game we're playing, right? We're playing a game called YouTube. You're playing a game called politics. Okay, so obviously in the game of YouTube, I have lost to Vosh and ContraPoints. They're more popular than me. They make more money than me. They can do this as their job, which is the ultimate measurement of me. They could do this as a job, and they could even support a family as a single wage earner. At this stage, they're both making like 6-figure salaries off YouTube, and ContraPoints doesn't even make that much videos. So by any objective measurement, they've beaten me at YouTube. Now, if YouTube was my game, how can I save myself from envy? I either have to admit that they've won or not. And no amount of saying like, gee guys, you gotta do something more. You gotta actually want to win. Wanting to beat ContraPoints at YouTube is not going to allow me to beat ContraPoints at YouTube. Even if I dedicated my life to doing YouTube and is 100% committed to it, I don't play to an audience the way ContraPoints does because I'm more interested in pulling them in a hard direction. So I can't do the Vosh tell the people what they want to hear type deal. B, I don't necessarily, as a right winger, I'm not going to have the institutional support that ContraPoints does and Vosh has. There's not enough progressive allies to pull me up. And C, I know for a fact that if I get big enough, they'll probably ban me anyway. So all of these things, it's not a consequence of me not wanting victory. It's not a consequence of me being a coward, like, Don the pleb would imply. It's just a consequence of the reality. And yet, even after all of this, even after losing in the strict statistics to ContraPoints and Vosh, I feel, looking at my own life and comparing it to ContraPoints, that I have won. I've won because I believe that my life is morally more fulfilled than ContraPoints is. And I wouldn't exchange my channel for hers for all of the money they make. Absolutely not. It's not even a temptation to begin with. And it's not even because, I said this, there's so many different reasons why this is true. If Don the pleb or people who follow in his footsteps do not have a larger moral or spiritual reason why their small victories mean more ultimately than their enemies' larger ones, I don't think that they have a movement that can sustain itself intergenerationally. Ultimately, Attila the Hun sacks Rome. Ultimately, the Vandals sack Hippo. I think it was the Vandals, right? And St. Augustine wasn't able to stop them. But his legacy was a larger spiritual victory. And as such, the legacy of the Vandals is nothing 2,000 years after their conquest, or 1,500. And the legacy of Roman Christianity is everything. That's what spiritual victories can give, and that's what's lacking. I forget, but again, communicating larger hope is how you communicate with them. And then just being realists. Kaimes 2-3 for $5 USA. Timothy 4-3. In late times, some will devote themselves to deceitful spirits who forbid marriage and require abstinence from food. Well, I think that's, I've been fooled by misattributions to the Bible before on this channel. But that looks authentic, and it's certainly accurate to what's going on. You'll forgive me an indulgence to a secular quote here, but I couldn't help but think of this. So I do read on occasion Steve Saylor, who writes for the Unanswered Review, because I find him kind of to be an interesting tactical processor of sort of the state society is in. And he does bring up a lot of interesting points. I agree with him or not. But I was on my money watchings of some offerings from BreadTube, and of course half this audience has all gone trans. He has this quote about transgenderism in the 21st century. And so Steve Saylor writes, in our present year, sacralism, not sarcasm, is the only tolerable attitude towards our holy eunuchs, e.g. trans people. They represent humanity's highest aspirations under progressive morality, sterility, self-fulfillment, and humiliating other people by forcing them to participate in your own mental illnesses for lots of social media likes. Hey, it's not the gospel, it's not Timothy, but as a descriptor of BreadTube and as a call out of the same phenomenons that the Greek Testaments were describing, I think this is a pretty good, accurate description of the trans social media phenomenon we've seen in the year of our Lord 2021. So, God, I have to get to the end of these super chats. Lost my place. Oh my God. I have to go faster, or I'm never going to get to the end of this. Creeper Weirdo for $2. Have you listened to the MGTOWN podcast? Straight up no, I can go on. The Wooster for $10. I think I might have already read this. Have you seen Adam Curtis's news documentary? It analyzes why conventional left-wing radicalism in the West has failed. I disagree with some of the points, but the doc is still pretty interesting. Unfortunately, I have not. And as I've always said this, I know Aaron McIntyre we're talking about this, post-left. Think post-left. If people are unsatisfied with a progressive movement, they're our ally. Now, there's some limitation to this. If they're hardcore Marxists and they're not actually willing to look beyond conventional Marxism to improve the state of the modern working class, I think we can more or less discard them as ideologues. But if they're genuine leftists who just want to improve the situation for people, I think these people need to be brought into the conversation by people who are dissidents. And that includes pretty much everyone from the dissident right. Racism 2. For $5. How far off do you... Oh, I already read this one last time. The question is, how far do you believe balkanization is? At least a few election cycles in the future. And that's the thing. Once you get beyond 8 years, predictions become kind of meaningless. Okay. Great. I think those are all of them. Okay. So I'm going to go back to Entropy, see if I have picked up all of the super chats here. And I guess I'm just going to kind of read the chat for a little bit and wind things down. I know there's been a lot. I hope I got everything. And I haven't missed anything here. Okay, so there are some Google Super Chats that I missed here. Toastius Warmy for $10. Do you think that there is a chance that a new faith could revitalize the right or defeat progressives? I feel like we're in the pre-Reformation, HRE, or pre-Christian Rome, and there's potential for change. Well, I mean, it's more or less a matter of definition. I certainly don't believe that any walking away from Christ's testament is any good thing. But insofar as the pre-Reformation Christianity was a fundamentally different faith than the post-Reformation, post-Trent Christianity, I think we've got something there. I think Christianity is going through a transformation that is the equivalent of Trent. And I think that the church is going to have another council like the Council of Trent, where they're going to have to reassert orthodox principles, and they're going to have to sharpen a lot of half-said principles, largely coming from a lot of the confusion that's occurred in the last 10 years. I mean, we are experiencing a type of... Zero Kev says you missed my entropy chat. Well, let's see. I did miss his entropy chat. Okay, well. Oh my God. I'm just trying to... I can't... I got a lot more super chats. Okay, so let's... Why weren't these showing up? Okay, well, whatever. I'll get to all of them, I promise. Okay, okay, so I think I answered the one about the new faith. I'm going to have to keep on going on. Yeah, I think that Christians don't walk... I mean, if you're like me, you have a fundamental commitment to the teachings of Jesus. And I can't imagine that will change. Well, I guess I could imagine it changes. I can't imagine not believing in God. I guess I could imagine learning that Christianity is false. Because it's a historical claim, obviously, right? So you can imagine any historical claim is false, right? But I don't take changes in religion lightly. But Christians need to be open to new people bringing new perspectives on how we do things, because we fundamentally need to do things in a different way. Someone from the chat says, if your family was in great immediate danger, you want someone like Don on your side. I totally agree. Don's a great guy. I'm just sort of, I guess I get kind of irritated. I get kind of irritated at the constant implication that the people who have an accurately pessimistic view at the proper role of political activism constantly get called out as implicit cowards. I mean, I guess maybe I'm being overly sensitive, and I apologize if I am. I certainly did not mean any personal affront to Don himself. But I totally want people like him on my side. I want to be allies. But I don't know. The conversation needs to get beyond this, right? Yes, we're losing. Maybe we've even lost. What next? Minor political offices, they're not what I'm interested in right now. And they're a high-risk endeavor. There's going to have to be some kind of separation of political goals. Yeah, I do want him on my side. It's not even a super chat. I'm going to have to keep on going here. Okay, I know I'm breaking form, but I'm doing the Google chat before I do the entropy. Please stop super chatting me. I'm just trying to get to the end of this. Okay, okay, so presumably I'm going to get to Sam153's question by going to the entropy super chats that were missed. I think I might have a false link to entropy. That might be why it's not appearing on my actual thing. So Sam153 says, I had a question that was missed, but no problem, Dave. Will be relevant in a future stream. Have a blessed Easter. Have a blessed Easter, everyone. We will be doing a prayer stream. It probably will not be a saved video on this channel, but I'll probably try to post it on my wife's channel. Bubblegum gun for $2. Let's just break the union and be done with it. Well, unfortunately, Bubblegum gun, the union won the Civil War, so secession is illegal, and the people who are against the union can't break it. The union can abolish itself if it wants to, but if anyone's going to actually facilitate political balkanization in the United States, that's going to have to be commissioned by a large part by a contingent of the cause that we currently know as the Democratic Party. Anything else is going to be completely useless. And yes, Iron Duke, I will do a stream with AA and Dawn. I'm sure that's going to come into the future. Okay. Epiphany Week for $5 for a pure contribution. Thank you very much. And for a $10 contribution says, what's your Instagram? I have it posted on my Telegram. I wonder if is there like a quick name I can read out? They always make this so difficult. I don't know. I'll post a link in the description of this video. That will be the easiest way to communicate it. I just post stupid videos like for my personal life stuff. To throw out to answer last thing's final question. The Warhammer faction I play, if the hints weren't enough, it's the do-it-yourself faction that works. It's the fun one, right? Maybe we can have a nerd stream. I've always wanted to have like a nerd stream with Aaron McIntyre. I'm not like a nerd culture kind of guy. I really want to keep the stuff that I like that's kind of cringe away from the channel, because sometimes I feel like it intrudes on the message of kind of living a life that's. But I feel it's. I don't know. I don't feel ashamed of the fact that I play kind of deep board games. I mean, I have a wife and a job and a kid, and I have a YouTube channel. Someone from the chat says, "Do you post your baby?" I do, but I put a block over the face. That's the thing. I always block out the face. I don't believe that children should have their face on social media, even if it's supposed to communicate an aesthetic. So if it's from the back, or I'll put like a blocker over his face or something like that. So anyway, please don't play that game anymore. Well, well, I mean, I don't know. I believe that maybe this is a discussion the reactionaries are going to have. Maybe it's a fair criticism. Maybe people just need to discard all sort of nerd hobbies. I think it's harmless fun for the most part. And, whatever. Okay, so I'm going to keep on going. Let's go to the entropy chat that I missed. So for Vile Van Gogh, for $10, do you think Nietzsche's theory of moral inversion could be incorporated into a cyclical view of history? Not necessarily the type of morality Nietzsche establishes, but the inversion itself as some. Well, I mean, this is sort of like how what we're going to end up with at the end of this left thing is going to be an anti-left force. I mean, the path to rebirth is to become post-left. The path to anti-whiteness is to become anti-whiteness. That's the stage of history we're entering in. The stage of history is compliance, never collaboration. The stage of history is I deny the spirituality of your religion, and I force you at all times to name your religion. I force you to name the religion you want me to bend a knee to. And then I deny its spiritual legitimacy. I think that is more or less equivalent to what Nietzsche was talking about when he was talking about the role of moral inversion, but it's been ages since I've read any Nietzsche. And as such, I only remember Nietzsche in aphorism. Yeah, I think I probably need, well, if we have time for any of this. Great hearing. Okay, so Sam153 for $25 USA. Wow. Great hearing or wisdom as usual. Riots coming after the Chauvin trial. I've watched the Chauvin trial for a little bit, mostly because an old right-wing personality, Pale Hominid, has reemerged after a very, very long time being silent. And I guess my reaction to Derek Chauvin's trial is, he gets convicted. First of all, he'll never get convicted of murder, I don't believe. But it's very clear from the evidence I've heard that he's guilty of, at most, manslaughter. Because there's no physical evidence that George Floyd died of strangulation. And there is a lot of evidence that what he was doing was recommended procedure for somebody who was in some kind of altered state. So between that, it seems like the most you could get is manslaughter legitimately. But when I watch the proceedings, it seems like everyone in the media and even some of the witnesses are trying to bend this so that they can tell the truth while still not giving any points to the defense. And it just looks like this strange mockery of justice, right? Under any rational system, we would reform our police system. If there was a safer way to restrain someone having a psychotic episode, we would change the police manuals. We might charge Chauvin with reckless, criminally negligent homicide. From my perspective, that's the best thing that could stick. That's the fullest extent we could charge him with. And this political theater wouldn't be a thing. But instead, now we have to watch the politicization of our justice system, where our justice system is literally run as part of political theater. At this stage, I'm not so sure what benefits the left the most. This not being an election year, the left usually doesn't like riots. I don't know how they can give the radical party, the radical portion of their party, a result that won't result in riots. Anything short of first-degree murder will not suffice. Aristocratic Owl for $5. When creating a new aesthetic cultural vision, should we take old cultural aesthetics from the West? Yes, absolutely. And it's not because, we're in love with the past or something. It's just because, you always have to take from the past. Just don't be afraid of taking from progressive sources. Don't do the steampunk thing where you're just trying to steal from romantic authors and stuff like that. That's like a good path towards total cringe. Be open to progressivism. Just try to move around its mistakes. Surrealism in abstract art, for instance, are methods which I think have been completely misused in the modern world, but are not things with no value. Just like Fulton Sheen used to say, dirt is simply matter in the wrong place. Blasphemy, well, not blasphemy, but bad art is usually just an aesthetic in the wrong place. I think abstract art has its place, but I think it very rarely is in a gallery, and it almost never is in a public art installation. I think that abstract art just has no place in the public square. I think it's mainly something that should be reserved for the classroom, for maybe a retreat center, and then some galleries, right? but it's just been misused. Yeah, I just think that, absolutely borrow from the past, but just be open-minded with what you see in the future. When progressives make art, keep in mind that they themselves are using memes and symbols that are not entirely their own. Take what's good and leave what's bad. That's the thing with Millennial Woes. He said recently that he likes brutalist architecture, and this is a good example of this. I've had the similar feeling to him. Brutalist architecture is an absolute monstrosity in the way it's been used. But brutalist architecture does have its beauty when used in the right place. In the right place, it does provide a feeling of desolation and vulnerableness that I find kind of artistic. And I think that insofar as previous commenters were saying that we're trying to invert the morality and express more an absence than a calling back, invoking that kind of bleakness is not something that reactionaries, post-leftists, or dissidents should shy away from at all. Zero Kev for $15. For months, Asians have been assaulted, killed, and raped by a certain group. As soon as some crazed sex freak goes on a rampage, the cathedral seizes on it. 10 whites killed in Colorado, and the cathedral ignores it. When will the average Joe get tired of this East Asia tier propaganda? Well, see, the average Joe doesn't get tired of this East Asia propaganda. The average Joe listens to people who he admires tell him what to believe. He's aware that people are lying of him, but he doesn't have the bandwidth to figure out exactly the nature of the lie. The Asian community is a good example of this. The Asian community always follows its leadership. Its leadership is democratic right now. Therefore, as much as Asians complain about being raped and murdered by the group we can't mention, no, not that one, the other one, that complaint is always reframed into a PC lens. And unfortunately, the massage parlor shooter gave the mainstream media just the narrative it needed to essentially dissolve the complaint into safe complaints about white supremacy. The thing to focus on always is not average Joe, but the person average Joe aspires to be. Your point when talking to these elites is not to contradict them. Well, it is to contradict them. It's not to argue with them, but it's to contradict them and introduce a narrative that they cannot incorporate into their own entertainment product. Sometimes it's through exaggeration. Like I asked a friend recently whether all murders in the world could not at this point be considered white supremacy. I kind of tried to ask that in a more honest way. But insofar as the Asian community, crime cannot be ignored. If we're going to break the coalition, it is here. Crime cannot be ignored because every crime is an implicit attempt to take over the government and assert supreme political authority, which is violence. The progressive mainstream ignores this at their peril. If Asian leaders ignore the nature of crime against their own community, then the average Asian Joes will look for new leaders. Most likely leaders that are reactionary or more reactionary friendly that come from China. Maybe reactionaries that are more aligned with Western reactionaries or the general dissidents that are in the West right now. At any rate, the persistence of crime will eventually mean that they tap out. And with that, that is the end of my super chats, and I think I am way over time. So I think I answered everything. I really do this time. Yeah. Yeah, I think I answered everything. So I'm going to say, well, I guess I'll return to you guys later this week with a more religiously focused stream, most likely. And at the for the moment, I will say, everyone have a wonderful Holy Week. Stay hopeful. Focus now on the large things that matter. And remember that our own political order is, if nothing, completely transitory. And that if we focus on winning in the large sense, we'll eventually win through. I know I've criticized a lot of people like Don the Pleb and he is the eunuch. I hope that they do not take this in a personal manner any more than they're talking about cowards I'll take in a personal manner. But I just really, really, really want to dissolve this disagreement between the two sides. And anyway, I'd like to say to everyone, I know I said I would end every live stream with a sort of a prayer or a poem. I'm going to kind of reserve the formal prayers and poetry for the next stream. But for the time being, I'll just offer sort of an unofficial well wishes, prayers, and blessings to all Christians and non-Christians alike this Holy Week. Seek redemption, seek renewal, seek the good, and love the things that are true, good, beautiful, and ultimately godly. And with that, guys, I'll wish you a very, very good night, and I'll talk to you on the next stream.